And we are live. Yep.
Hello and welcome to the January 22nd meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Thank you all for joining us at our earlier start time. As a reminder, the Planning and Zoning Commission receives public comment for our meetings by any of the following means in person. You can come and you're limited to a maximum of 3 minutes if you're speaking as an individual, or 10 minutes if you're speaking as a group's primary spokesperson. We also receive public comment in advance via written comments to pzcommissioners@asheville.nc.gov, which is available up until 5 p.m. the day before our meetings. And new this month, we have a new way to provide public input through a portal on with the UDO text amendments that staff has put together through public input. So keep an eye on opportunities to provide input directly to items coming to Planning and Zoning Commission through public input. With that, I will turn it over to Will Palmquist for roll call.
Thank you. Chair Barton.
Present.
Vice Chair Griner.
Present.
Commissioner Faircloth.
Present.
Commissioner Cycle.
Present.
And Commissioner Bell.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Palmquist. We're also joined by our council liaison, Maggie Ullman. Thank you for joining us today. First up on our agenda in the administrative section is our land acknowledgement, and I'll read this today. As we are gathered today as the Planning and Zoning Commission, the body tasked with reviewing and advising on appropriate land use in the city of Asheville, it is fitting to acknowledge the storied history of this land. We occupy the land of the Cherokee people, who have stewarded and been in relationship with these mountains and waterways from time immemorial. This land is occupied through violence, oppression, coercion, broken treaties, and forced relocation. Please join me in expressing respect and gratitude for the present-day Eastern Band of Cherokee, the Cherokee Nation, the United Gadua Band of Cherokee, and all of our indigenous neighbors, as well as the past and present marginalized community members, as we seek to join in the healing of the indelible trauma that is embedded in this land. Thank you. Next up, we have the minutes from our last meeting, December 4th, 2024. I did note a couple of clerical corrections in these. For the approval of minutes for the SUP ordinance and findings of fact, the date noted should be September 4th, 2024. The zoning text amendment with the floodplain ordinance notes a vote of 6-1 and should note that the no vote was Commissioner Wheatley. And then finally, in the text describing the presentation on that, there's just a typo. It says scene level instead of sea level. Any other corrections or notes on last meeting minutes? Not all. Entertain a motion.
Motion to approve as amended.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Next up, we have an annual tradition, the annual report that this body will submit to City Council. In it, a bit of an unusual year given the events of the last couple months of 2024 due to Tropical Storm Helene. So we tried in this draft to capture the activities of the Planning and Zoning Commission prior to that, but then also set goals and recommendations based on sort of our initial assessment of what's happened post-Helene. I guess I'd like to kick off a little bit of discussion on this as we finalize and send to the clerk's office this Friday. Couple of highlights to pull out is in this, we're actually asking for, given the high level of public conversation around flood protection ordinance and stormwater protections, all of the lessons we've learned, and all of the prior reports the city's commissioned, it seems like it would be beneficial to convene a public forum and perhaps a joint session of Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council to really dig into these issues. So it's obviously, just a recommendation in this report, but that's something that I think would help us advance further analysis and understanding of where our regulations are at today and how we can encompass lessons learned and work not done from prior assessments for these issues. We've also, there's been some interest among some commissioners in actually formalizing a working group at Planning and Zoning Commission around flood protection ordinance, stormwater issues. Any discussion around that or further interest? Commissioner Bell, this was one of things that...
Yeah, this was something I was very interested in and supportive and wanting to be involved in a group like that to dive deeper into the policies and the possibilities with floodplain and stormwater ordinances.
Yeah, I second that. It's also something I'm very excited about delving more into. I think having some sort of a working group of the commission that focuses specifically on these issues, I think is timely. I'm also very excited in the annual report, the upcoming goal, the first bullet, of holding a joint session with City Council related to lien damage assessment reports and how these relate to FEMA and other regulatory reforms that could potentially come down the pike. I'm very excited about that kind of potential to bringing it to a public forum.
I like the idea of the suggested idea of that working group being created. I don't know if I'm the appropriate person for that. I would like to make the comment that while I'm excited there's people wanting to create that working group, I feel like whenever a working group is being created, we should create some kind of very brief mandate or word or topic, or just it could be 2 sentences of something saying this is the target or this is the deliverable or what exactly is happening. I don't want to just create a group without any kind of general guide, general compass point, just like we have our own, mission statement. So that'd be my suggestion, Mr. Chair.
And perhaps a sunset too, that could be reviewed, but sometimes we have these things forever and ever, and it's like, here's the purpose, here's the timeline, and then go from there.
And I don't think it's necessary that we have to have that before the working group's created. That could be meeting number 1. What's our brief mode of operation or direction? But I think being on the committee, I wanted to see that there is some kind of guide rail where that's going.
I think that's really helpful feedback. I would agree. I think we want to make sure there's focus and purpose, not just meetings for meeting's sake. As a reminder, a working group really can consist of less than a quorum of Planning and Zoning Commission, so up to 3 members kind of informally discussing a topic that then they can flesh out and bring more specific proposals back to this board, as well as, collaborate with staff on potential future updates. So it's just kind of a vessel for a little bit more informal dialogue, exploration that we may not have the time to do within our regular meetings.
I think I'd also like to commend Chair Barton for doing all the heavy lifting on the annual report. I know we all gave input into it, but it was a really good document to try to pick apart. And not much was done. So thank you.
Thank you for that, and thanks to staff for providing support as well. Sifting back through the prior 9 months of work with the commission is always difficult to capture everything that we've done, but appreciate the work of staff to kind of help inform what we've done over the year and where we'll head next. So it sounds like there's interest in a working group, particularly from Commissioners Bell and Cycle, maybe between now and our next meeting. the two of you can get together and kind of sharpen a focus on that, and then at our next meeting, we can really formalize what the next steps might look like, as well as we will have submitted this report to council by then and maybe seek some feedback on whether a joint session might be possible. So that would give further purpose to the working group as a help guide what the agenda of the joint session will be. Great, well, thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you for that feedback. The last thing I'll highlight in the annual report is an evergreen request from Planning and Zoning Commission to rewrite the UDO. This has been included for many years, and we hope this might be the year. However, the General Assembly really threw a wrench into things with some legislation that passed at the very end of the year that could inhibit the ability of municipalities to embark on long-range planning initiatives. And I'll kick it over to our City Attorney, Brad Branham, for a brief explanation on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that. And I will be somewhat brief about this. The legislation you're referring to, which is pertinent not only to a UDO rewrite, but to many potential zoning, development regulation changes going forward, not just for Asheville, but for the state as a whole, came about as part of a piece of legislation which was originally styled as Senate Bill 382 in the previous session of the General Assembly. At the end of the year, as you said, that became law. You can now be found as Session Law 2024-57. And I'm going to tell you that that's 131 pages of legislation. The only portion that I think is really pertinent to what you're talking about, but it is heavily pertinent, is found on, I believe, page 130. And it deals with amending State Statute 160D/106D, I think. Don't quote me on that. But it is the provision dealing with what we call down zoning. Down zoning is something that's been around in the state for a number of years, and there have been regulations around it, essentially eliminating the possibility that third parties would rezone someone else's property without their consent. Local governments have always been exempt from that until this legislation. And in part, this legislation did two things. It eliminated the exception for local governments, meaning that the restriction around down zoning now includes local governments and limits their ability to do that. And secondarily, it expanded the definition of what is encompassed in a down zoning. Without going into too much detail, I will tell you that this is really a sea change for local government planning and zoning planning and future action, specifically for large-scale changes such as updating the UDO, up to and including the possibility that would almost eliminate the possibility of updating a UDO. We, as a group of city attorneys, as well as other third-party entities, are actively working with the legislature right now to maybe take another look at this in the coming session. But it is going to be something that until and if any such changes occur, this body, as well as the city as a whole, is going to have to be very, very careful about considering future major development and zoning changes that aren't owner-initiated. And with that said, I won't go into any more detail. I will say that I'm providing a more extensive report on this, as it were, to the City Council on Thursday as part of their biweekly agenda briefing. So if anyone in the public is more interested in hearing more about that, please tune in for what I'm sure will be a riveting presentation about some new legislation.
Thank you for that, Mr. Branham. And yeah, we'll keep an eye on things for anyone who may be listening out there, our droves of adoring fans. Now's the time to reach out to your state lawmakers and say, hey, let's take another look at this. It may have some drastic impacts in Western North Carolina as we seek to recover from a devastating hurricane and really have a high need for long-range planning. So look forward to tuning into your longer presentation to council and hearing what we can do about it.
Do you need a motion to file the report?
I don't think we do.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if there's any changes, or recommended changes, feel free to send them. For anybody listening or in attendance today, if you had a chance to read the annual report, it's in our meeting materials for today. If there's things in there that you'd like to see taken up at the city level, great opportunity for input both through us and City Council. So I think we'll move on to the next agenda item. Next up, item number 4, a request to conditionally rezone property located at 3183 Sweeten Creek Road from residential multifamily high-density district RM16 to residential expansion conditional zone RES EXP-CZ. The property's pins are identified on the meeting agenda, and the property owner is SCCP LLC. The applicant contact is Mr. Warren Sugg. Planner coordinating review is Sam Starbaum. Mr. Starbaum.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. It is good to be before you today. Again, for the record, my name is Sam Starbaum. I'm in Planner 3 with Planning and Urban Design. And as you said, we do have a conditional zoning petition before us on Sweeten Creek. This will look a lot like my other presentations you have seen. We'll start with some aerial imagery and then some zoning maps to really paint the context of where this is and what is happening. Here is Exhibit B, which is also in your packet. You can see the conglomeration of parcels that make up what is addressed as 3183 Sweeten Creek. There are on this already 23 residential units, which are a mix of single-family homes, cottage units, mobile homes, and double-wide mobile home units. Those are all there. I would be happy to talk about ownership and what is happening for the existing tenants and occupants of these. As of right now, they are month to month and are aware that this action is coming down the pike, and I will also let the applicants speak to the outreach they have done to the residents that are currently on this property. But this is where you can see exactly where this proposed development is. The road in the bottom left-hand corner is Long Shoals Road. This is identified in a number of city documents as sort of an urban center, and then there is also an anchor and employment institution as you move north along Hendersonville Road. This will be accessed by Sweeten Creek, but it is certainly within a watershed corridor of that major intersection. In fact, it's about 1,000 feet as the crow flies. It's going to be a little bit longer as you walk, and there are actually 2 bus stops within that same distance. It's for the northbound S3 and S6, which go to Biltmore Park and the airport and Egg Center. So this is where we see this development. It's surrounded by a series of other developments that are like this. I'll get into the existing zoning and future zoning, but it is not uncommon to see a mix of HB and higher density and intensity zoning districts here. In fact, RM16 is quite common. You can see the very beginning of Skyline Exchange on the lower left-hand corner. There is also the Kensington Place, which is RM16 in the upper right, as well as the Carlisle and the Arbor Terrace, also RM16 developments, all within this photo. This is the same photo, just from a different angle. You can see the north arrow on the left-hand corner gives you a sense of the buildings. You can see the school. You can see a lot of the commerce, and it does also have Long Shoals Road, shows where that intersection is with Hendersonville Road relative to the land. You do get a sense of where this is, the canopy coverage, and sort of a better alternate view of where those existing units are. And then here's this existing and proposed zoning. What is existing is RM16. Again, this is the highest density zoning in Asheville's Unified Development Ordinance. What they are proposing is to go to a residential expansion, and you can see that the border with CI actually ends at the property line border, so there is no future land use designation that is required. The only trigger, again, for a zoning here is not anything to do with underlying zoning districts. It is the thresholds, which we will be visiting later in this meeting. And here is the future land use map from our Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan. This is in a residential neighborhood. This is not an uncommon underlying zoning. In fact, in our Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan, we do discuss how RM16 and proposed residential EXP are considered appropriate for this designation. And again, we are not changing the future land use map in this action. We're only just changing from RM16 to residential expansion, and that is what is proposed. But you can find that what is called for here is internal connectivity, an increase of sidewalks and density that is found in these types of developments. And this slide is where I diverge from my normal cadence, my normal pattern of giving presentations. I kind of want to do this like a Quentin Tarantino movie. I've heard from council, I've heard from the Planning and Zoning Commission that there is a real emphasis that needs to be placed on our goals and our plans and to see how it aligns with those. So I'm sort of putting the ending at the beginning. And so what this development will do, and as I will demonstrate and explain in these next slides, is this largely, not exactly, but largely conforms and supports existing Living Asheville goals. It's providing infill development, it's increasing and diversifying the housing supply, and it is consistent, again, with that future land use designation of residential neighborhood. I will leave this slide up for a little bit while you can read that. And those are not the only plans that this conforms with. I know that there was some commissioner questions about how does this pair with the GAP plan? What are transportation comments? What does this look like? Because this is near an urban center where we are looking to increase density. And we can say that, yes, as far as the GAP plan, Sweeten Creek from Creighton Road to Rock Hill is a priority project in our ADA plan. And then Sweeten Creek from NC 280 to city limits is considered a priority in the pedestrian plan as well. We'll get into a little bit about connectivity and sidewalks when we get to the site plan. But this is something, again, that doesn't fix everything, but largely conforms with these plans, and that's why staff is going to recommend approval, and I'll get into the nitty-gritty about that in a little bit. So here's the site plan. It is going to be 304 overall residential units. You're going to see 280 of these split across 5 residential buildings, and then you're going to have 24 townhome units in 6 buildings. There are also 28 garages and a mixed building. It's accessed from 2 points on Sweeten Creek. North is to the left on the screen, or to your, still to your left on that screen. You can see the presence of an existing stream that is there and the appropriate 30-foot aquatic no-build buffer that is there. And then you can also see that blue triangle, which is the proposed stormwater. What is also relevant and not at all unique to this property, it is most common on Sweeten Creek Road, certainly for, I think I can say this with exclusively every project I've done on Sweeten Creek Road. There is also the presence of a railroad and the 100-foot easement that's owned by Blue Ridge Southern Railway, which I think is a division or subsidiary of Norfolk Southern. It is really common. That does not encumber the property in a way that limits how they can do tree canopy preservation. The requirement is still there just for open space and tree canopy preservation. Their calculation is just removes that 100 feet of easement. So you will still find all the same requirements. They just can't do some permanent things in that land, and I could talk about that. Again, we're recommending approval of this. This slide was actually supposed to be before the site plan. There are just a few other things I want to talk about here. There was one ministerial error in there. This was submitted just before the hurricane, and the TRC application, it had been noted that there are 24 bike parking spaces provided, 21 are required. I think in that memo it mentions 20. In the previously submitted application there was a drawing error that has been amended. All required bicycle parking spaces are present, and they have even gone 3 above that to 24. Again, we're looking at 492 vehicular parking spaces, 9 ADA spaces, and insofar as connectivity is concerned, they are provided here. You can see where these sidewalks are. They are 5 feet sidewalks internally, which would be a technical modification. You can also see the sidewalk along Sweeten Creek Road that is currently proposed to be a 5-foot sidewalk with a 10-foot landscape buffer on that arterial road. I can talk a little bit about that or answer any other questions you may have about arterial roads and what the normal requirement is. But that takes us to the site plan, again, through the recommendation. Here's the landscape plan. You can see that landscaping standards are met. There is the street tree, the building impact, and parking lot landscaping. Because this is residential and there is an abutting RM district, there will be a required type A property buffer that's 20 feet. That has been provided on the plan. The only thing we don't have is the mix and allocation of species. That's not uncommon. That is something we typically do see at the TRC final review level. And then, of course, open space and tree canopy preservation are required for this. The open space is being provided. It's 3.72 acres. And then the applicants are choosing to preserve tree canopy through 15%, and that is 101,750 square feet. They have submitted the required TCP plat, but they still need to show, especially where some of these are very close to the property line, where the critical root zones will stay out of that, to make sure that it is within their control, and that is something that we can still apply. And then these are the technical modifications that are being sought. You know, the project does propose a 5-foot minimum sidewalk within the internal site layout, and as I had referenced earlier, they are proposing a minimum 5-foot sidewalk and a 10-foot grass strip. Usually that would be a 10-foot sidewalk along Sweeten Creek because of its nature. I will let the applicants speak to why they are seeking this, and then the project will require that enter the 30-foot aquatic buffer as well as the railroad right-of-way to connect to existing sewer. This is a common technical modification or a request in projects like this where there are the presence of those railway easements that encumber a lot of these properties on Sweeten Creek Road, and then anyone that has a 30-foot buffer, they will repair to its existing condition as well. And then, of course, they are townhome units, so they will not have the required setbacks that you would find because they are attached townhomes. So this brings us to what we're looking at here. This is the building elevations for the 5 apartment units. You're seeing stone veneer on the bottom, green on the side. This will be what the townhomes look like. The third elevation is that community space, community use building. And then that final elevation will be the garages. There are 28 garages provided for apartment residents as well. And then this gets us to the review process. This was reviewed on August 19th, 2024. There were no issues with the technical review committee, passed, and this was supposed to go before October 2nd, 2024 at the PZC meeting. That didn't happen. We are now able to convene. And I just wanted to circle back to that recommendation and here before I stand for any questions. I would like to underscore that again, it is not staff's opinion that this is the perfect development, but that it largely conforms with both our future land use map, which is calling for residential neighborhood, and largely conforms with what is the type of developments we are seeking near urban centers as we consider a host of amendments to add density where density makes sense. So that is a very brief overview of this development. I figured there'd be a lot of questions, so I reserved a lot of time for that, and I would be happy to answer any that you may have.
Thank you. Initial questions from commissioners? We also have the applicant here who will provide a presentation, but questions of staff?
What are some of those nonconformities that you mentioned with our goals with the comp plan, or that the project is mostly conforming?
I want to be careful about using the language nonconformity because that is a different zoning term. I can talk instead about ways in which this can more closely align with our projects. And again, I think pedestrian connectivity would be a number one. Bicycle parking, any sort of these things where if we're considering thresholds that include AMI, things like this, or AMI reductions for affordable housing, things like this, where we can make those a consideration in this project, because connectivity is big in living Asheville, it's big in our future land use map, it is certainly a huge part of our UDO, and we really stress the importance of that, and certainly with an arterial road such as Sweeten Creek, for those who have traveled on it, pedestrian safety is and should be a concern from the planning perspective. So not non-conforming, there are just ways in which it can more closely align.
Thank you, Mr. Starbaum. That was a good presentation. I have one, I liked a lot of what you presented. I do have one kind of disagreement or gripe, is that so the urban center is on Skyland, correct?
Yes.
Down there. So while I get this is like, as the crow flies close to it,
Mhm.
there's not a crossing of that railroad there. So to get to that urban center, you're going up to Mills Gap and down, or you're going down to Ross Cragen, which is
Mhm.
I live right in this area,
Okay.
so I know
Yeah.
the streets very well. Like, it's really tiny, winding road. So
Mhm.
like, yes, it's close to the urban center, but it's not exactly across the street because of the railroad. I just want to make that point to
Mhm.
the other commissioners.
Yeah, it feels very disconnected.
And I want to be clear in response, if I may, Commissioner, it is not the intent to be misleading. I had also measured that is 3,600 feet on, if you're walking Ross Cragen most directly. Again, that's with measuring ortho imagery, so that's probably not correct, but it is to recognize that is not immediately there. And again, this is residential neighborhood and not urban center, but it is worth considering certainly in the built environment that surrounds this, and again, with those other larger residential developments that I mentioned in residential neighborhoods like Kensington and Argyle or Carlisle.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting you were
Yeah.
misleading. I
Yeah.
just wanted I live in this area, so
Yeah.
I know, well, I just wanted to let the other commissioners know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, current no sidewalks in this area at all, right?
There are, in this area, can you, yeah, there are some. It depends on where in this area you mean. This would
Nothing
undeniably,
adjacent.
yeah, there are some not immediately adjacent, but certainly in the area. And what this would do would add considerable sidewalks from here to Argyle, and then you can get to Ross Cragen that way. So it is a pedestrian connectivity improvement.
To that end, you referenced the gap plan. I think that was actually a question also raised by a fellow commissioner who's not here tonight before the meeting. But can you kind of articulate how this area fits into the gap plan and any kind of long-range plans for greater connectivity?
That is something, I mean, what I can say is quoting directly from Lucy Crown, who is the Transportation Planning Division Manager. The important components and the takeaways from the GAP plan is that Sweeten Creek from Creighton Road to Rock Hill Road is a priority project in the ADA plan, which is providing connectivity, is making sure that there are the sidewalks for accessibility. All the appurtenances that go with that. I don't have, I think, the appropriate language because I am not an accessibility expert to talk about what exactly that entails, but that is considered. This is something that furthers that by sort of helping provide sidewalks and then making sure that just everything from North Carolina Highway 280 to city limits is considered a priority in the pedestrian plan. So adding sidewalks is something that helps meet that goal for GAP and increasing connectivity. And this is always the hard part as a planner because I am often asked, are there sidewalks in the area? And I say some. Are they connected? No. Is that connectivity? No. But what happens is when you get a preponderance of these projects, that's sort of how you get connectivity is a little at a time, absent major federal funding or allocations in bonds, things like that. So it is considered that way in GAP. And then I can also say that I did hear from a number of individuals about NCDOT with the widening that is being planned. There are funds allocated. There is some discussion about planning happening in 2031, but there is no definitive timeline, and it is all entirely contingent upon the state budget, which now has a serious deficit in terms of infrastructure to rebuild from Helene. So I didn't even bring that up in the presentation because that's a whole other can of worms.
Thank you. We likely have more questions for the applicant, but any other questions for staff? Thank you, Mr. Starbaum.
Thank you, commissioners.
We'll welcome the applicant to provide a presentation or fill in any missing information.
Sure, I tried to do a little bit of both. I appreciate Sam's work on this, and it's kind of weird with the stop-start.
Could you introduce yourself?
I will. My name is Derek Allen. I'm attorney at Allen, Stahl, and Kilborn, and I represent the development team on this. We have several of those members here tonight. We have Matthew Rankin and Brian Wise. With the development team, we have Warren Sugg from Civil Design Concepts. And again, I was thanking staff, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks everybody for their time on this oddly timed Wednesday afternoon Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. But the stop and start piece of this was a little bit weird, and so we're getting back up to speed here and getting reacquainted with the materials. But one of the things I wanted to lead with is, I guess, forecasting what you guys are going to be discussing later on, the text amendments. This project is here as a conditional zoning request because of the number of units, the density, everything else inside of this project with some very small modifications is as of right under the ordinance. It's just the developed number of units. And so I don't know what the right number is, and we'll continue to debate that. I think it needs to be higher than 50, but we'll see what the right number is. But we're going to point that off at the beginning. I also wanted to point out that the landowner in this project has had this property and held it for 20 years. The landowner plans to stay in this project. And this development team, this would be their third project that I've worked on with them in the Asheville area. Both the other two are buy and hold projects where they hold them for extended amounts of time. One is another large apartment project, and the other one is an adaptive reuse, which is in downtown Asheville that is across from the hotspot. It's called the Duke, and it's a really cool project. So they look for those areas where we need those infill types of units, and Sweeten Creek is one of those places where there's a ton of traffic going back and forth, and they're typically going to where they live or from where they live to their jobs. And so to have living quarters closer by it is a good policy piece. Sam did a great job going through our comprehensive plan and why this fits with the comprehensive plan goals. I did want to hit a couple of things that I think are important here. One was there are 23 units out there. Those units are all month-to-month units. We've already reached out to them. We've reached out to them a second time. I'm not sure if that's in the staff materials, but we have kept them up to speed on what's happening and what the timeline is. In terms of having to move, this isn't something that they have to move for probably a year or more. We do have a plan that we're going to put together that's mentioned in the staff report in terms of moving stipend as well as providing alternative housing options and making those referrals as part of that effort. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the sidewalks. The internal sidewalk connections, we see this all the time on these kinds of projects, reducing them from 10 feet to 5 feet. It reduces impervious areas. It allows us to have more green space, and it serves to decrease the heat island effect. In terms of the sidewalk along Sweeten Creek Road, I did have one slight correction to Sam's staff report, and that is I don't think that a 10-foot sidewalk is required along that stretch. I do think that it is a suburban artery, and that requires a 5-foot sidewalk with an 8-foot planting strip, and we have a 5-foot sidewalk with a 10-foot planting strip. And we got those numbers actually from another project that was recently approved. It's for the U-Haul on Sweeten Creek, and that has a 5-foot pavement and a 10-foot planting strip, just like we're offering here. And then there's another project that has a 6-foot sidewalk that's at 3130 Sweeten Creek, and they've recently submitted plans to eliminate that sidewalk altogether. So getting to that, where do we provide sidewalks and how do you connect them ultimately? I think it's a good question, but one that we are at least doing our part here on this project. The NCDOT plans, if they ever come along, call for a multi-use path on one side and a sidewalk along the other side. So hopefully that happens and we get all the connectivity that we need for pedestrians and bikes out there. At this point, what I would like to do is invite up Warren Sugg to walk through the technical compliance parts of the actual site plan and how it complies with the code and answer any questions that are of a technical nature. Warren?
Thank you, Derek. Warren Sugg with Civil Design Concepts, local civil engineering firm. Good to be with you guys this evening. It took us a number of months to get here, but we're happy to be here. I'm going to run through the site plan, and I'm sure you guys may have some questions for me, and I'll be happy to answer those. So, I don't know, do you guys have the plan sheets in your online? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay. I'm just going to kind of quickly walk through those. So C101 is our existing conditions sheet. And I noticed that there was some talk over the modifications. I'll bring to your attention, I'll sort of point to, there's an existing trailer that's here and some parking, and that is inside of the stream buffer today. So a lot of what you're seeing that we're asking for is we need to pull that out of the stream buffer and restore it as best we can there. We do have two other places where we're touching the stream buffer, one being tying into the sewer, which is down to the west beside the railroad right-of-way. Got about 200 square foot of sort of temporary impact. We need to be able to make that connection and then restore it. And then we do have a dissipator pad that comes out of one of our sediment basins, and we can go those sediment basins on page C301 in a moment. It's about 65 square feet. So very small areas, but we're trying to get the project done and then restore. And outside of that, I'm not aware of any proposed impacts to the stream buffer. As you flip to C201, this is the site plan. This walks you through the meat of what the project is. So as you enter off of the northern side of Sweeten Creek, that's one of our access points. That comes in. We've got some site triangles shown there, as well as the sidewalk and the green space that was just spoken about. Buildings 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the apartment buildings. So those are multi-level, 4-story multifamily buildings. You'll see finished floors on each of those. The garages are on the western side. It actually acts as a little bit of a buffer between these residential units and the railroad. Sort of going counterclockwise, and now you've passed building 5, you get to the multi-use building. That'll be the area where the likely mail service and maybe some other amenity services are within that. As you come up along Sweeten Creek, you'll see buildings A, B, C, D, E, and F. Those are the townhome units, and they are part of the project, but they're somewhat segregated on their own drive with driveways. And then in the middle of the project, you see the clubhouse. That's the main amenity. So clubhouse, leasing facility, pool deck, and all the items that'll be within that. All throughout this, you'll see parking spaces, both standard and handicap ADA spaces at each of these buildings, meeting those requirements. You'll also see a good bit of sidewalk along each of these buildings, and then some crosswalks that sort of get you connected throughout the project and then connect you over to Sweeten Creek. That sidewalk does connect out to Sweeten Creek on our southern entrance. That's the area that's got less topo coming in, so it's going to be a lot nicer way of being able to get in and out. The northern driveway is a little bit steeper to drop down into the site. We also have some dumpster pad area as you first come in on that southern area, so that'll really limit that heavy-duty pavement having to come in. It also make it so that residents can easily drop off trash as they go in and out of the development. You also see a fairly large above-ground stormwater control measure on the southwest corner of the site, buffering up against the railroad and the stream buffer. That's one of 2 stormwater features that we're expecting here, so we've got that. And then we also have a storm tech system that will live in the eastern side of Building 5's parking lot. Those are the 2 main stormwater controls. This is an 18-acre site, about 13 acres of disturbance. We are meeting the parking requirements and have some extra, like I said, 24 townhomes, 280 apartments. We've got our 20% open space and our 15% tree canopy. As you flip to 301, you start to see the rough grading plan, and once again, this is all fairly conceptual in nature. We'll get into the final details as we get to final TRC and certainly into construction drawings. But you do see the grading expected here, as well as a number of walls to help us get this area flattened to where we need it. As you go to page C501, that's the preliminary stormwater layout. That's where you'll see some of the storm piping and storm outlet locations. C601 is our rough water and sewer connection plans. So our water is going to connect off of Sweeten Creek on the northern edge of the property. That's where our master meter and RPZ will come in, and then we'll be a running water line that'll be both our fire protection and our domestic protection. We've got fire hydrants throughout the development, and then sanitary sewer, as mentioned earlier, is connecting down in the southwest corner and then traversing up through our site to serve each of the buildings for waste needs. L101 is the landscape compliance plan. This is starting to show those items such as street trees, vehicular use trees, building impact, property line buffering. You also see some trees that were picked up in the survey that are along the stream buffer and also along the aforementioned railroad right-of-way, which we understand is out of bounds, but we did want to understand what was happening over there in the areas that we did not expect to be touching. And then lastly, you'll see on L201, this is the tree canopy coverage plan. So we have more than enough area down in the stream buffer with what can be preserved to meet the 15%. And as always, if we need to plant additional to make sure we hit that 15%, that's always a very good likelihood or ability. And then, you know, if we couldn't meet it with both of those, we could certainly pay the fee in lieu, but that's not our intent. There's a good site here that could be more than enough. After that, you get into the elevations, and I'm not the expert on those, so I won't try to speak to them. Questions of me?
Thank you, Mr. Sugg. A couple of questions, really more process-oriented, might be more for Mr. Allen. You mentioned in your initial remarks there's some start and stop, you know, obvious we had a hurricane here. Could you talk a little bit about how that impacted, you know, neighborhood meeting process, and was that did that happen before, and then now we are in a special meeting, so was neighborhood re-engaged? What were some of the comments you heard?
Yeah, so the neighborhood meeting did happen a number of months ago. It was pre-event, and during that, I had to do it online. That was a difficult time for me. That was a time when my mother actually passed away, but I do remember most of the comments. It was largely around the folks that were there today, what was going to happen, when this project was kind of progressing through the process. At that time, I gave them somewhat incorrect information because I didn't know that the events were going to happen, but I told them that, you know, we would be going through this CZ or entitlement process over the next 2 to 3 months. It's now been, you know, closer to probably 6 months since we had that meeting. So that was kind of how that one went. I know the neighborhood meeting and its sort of meeting minutes were part of the submittal packet as well. So I'm not sure if that's in y'all's dockets or not. But.
It's often hard to find. Sometimes it's like linked from the TRC, or it's pretty embedded. But.
Yeah, and because of that gap, I think the question may be geared towards this. That's one of the reasons we sent another letter out in the last, I don't know, 8 days or so, just to remind folks what's happening, what the timeline is, and we'll continue to keep them updated on that timeline.
And that letter went out to residents on the property, not necessarily surrounding property owners. That just was kind of a one-time neighborhood meeting process.
Correct.
Thank you for that. The other question that, you know, obvious anytime we're talking Sweeten Creek, we're talking traffic. So traffic impact analysis, can you talk through that process? It's referenced in the TRC.
Sure.
Just any recommendations that you've gotten so far? Was that process paused due to the hurricane? Or, you know?
Yeah, luckily it did not get paused just because of the timing of it. We actually have the final decision letter back from DOT, which is sort of final say. So to backtrack a little bit, yes, we went through the process not only to include the city of Asheville's traffic folks, but also NCDOT on the scoping, and that's the point at which the traffic consultant talks with both entities and says, hey, what intersections do you want studied? What do you need in order to have a full TIA? They then do the field work. I don't know the exact dates. I can go find it, but most of this happened back towards the summer and fall, and then that was submitted not only to NCDOT but to the city traffic. NCDOT then goes through their process, which is a 10-day checking the scoping, and then a 20-day, these are working days, completeness review, and then they give the final determination letter. We have that final determination letter. They've agreed with the TIA recommendations of the consultant, which was make sure we have internal stem links that are necessary, which we have, and then there was no other left, right, turn movement type things. There was a recommendation to continue to monitor, I believe it was Sweeten Creek and Mills Gap. I'll look at my paper in just a moment, but there was one intersection to keep an eye on, but no pavement changes at this time. And they also coordinated with DOT, knowing that it might be a project that comes through there.
Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody for such an extensive presentation. I think the presentation, you know, between the start from Mr. Starbaum to Mr. Allen to Mr. Sugg, I think was very thorough as far as what the planning department, how they see it, and then, you know, all the way down to the detailed analysis of the plans. And I think in light, as Mr. Allen said, in light of us, revisiting the thresholds coming up, the fact that this is before us, I think really it's just the number of units and then some minor technical modifications. One or a couple of which relate to the buffer, which are absolutely necessary to get the project done and are temporary in nature. Half of that is restoring the buffer. And then the other two related to the sidewalks. Internal sidewalks of a project this size, having 5-foot width, I think is okay. And then when it comes to the 5 foot on the exterior of the property, I heard there may be disagreement about what's required, whether it's 10 foot or 5 foot. But I think the 10-foot gap between the sidewalk and Sweeten Creek, especially right now when there's not direct connectivity to any other sidewalk, I think is very important for safety. And so I wouldn't be necessarily inclined to push back too hard on widening that sidewalk. The only thing that I can note that I think maybe should make it into the plan that may have just been a mistake is crosswalk crossing Road B for the sidewalk entering the property. If you just look at sheet 201, I feel like there should be.
This
Yep.
sidewalk, the crosswalk there?
Well, not that that crosswalk's there, but crossing Road B
I'm sorry, I don't have road.
as you come.
That's Road B.
Okay.
Yeah.
There. Here?
No, lower.
I'm gonna let you
Yeah,
point
sorry.
here.
Right here, this sidewalk as you're crossing. Yeah, yeah. Yep. And that's all I have. I think, it's a pretty straightforward project.
Thank you, commissioners, and if I may just hop in real quick, I want to clarify two things in terms of neighborhood public notice. The applicant had met their requirements. It is worth noting that post-event, we have still re-noticed. All the adjacent applicants were made aware with all the usual notice requirements that go forward with Planning and Zoning Commission, so the sign was there. All sorts of information was available post, just as we noticed for October 2nd, we did for this meeting as well, so it wasn't just internal. The requirements, I think, are a little bit different for applicant than it is for staff and for hosting these legislative hearings. So there was that. I did want to clarify something on the sidewalks. This is where it had gotten a little bit messy because there is the discussion of the multi-use path, what is currently aiming for and what the applicant is proposing, and then also with the SSDM. So it is correct that a 5-foot sidewalk is what is required along Sweeten Creek. The multi-use path, we are seeking to have a 10-foot sidewalk there in the future. And then also with, just because of the speed of an arterial, because of all of that, the wider the sidewalk we can get, the city would support that.
Yeah.
Of course, then that becomes a different modification and the applicants would have to consent to that. So that's a little bit about noticing, a little bit about sidewalks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Just so I'm following, the 5-foot sidewalk as shown complies, or does it need to be a technical modification?
This is fun. It also still needs a technical modification because they have increased that buffer width by 2, which is not what's in the
I think it's
SSDM.
worth noting that the residential expansion district, since it's moved into a level 3, does explicitly require a 10-foot wide sidewalk. So there is a zoning district requirement for sidewalks in residential expansion
For internal, is that along the,
for external and internal.
okay.
So you've got a lot of different things that are telling you the width of the sidewalk and the
Yeah.
width of the green space. And
Right.
So
we want a sidewalk.
for
I
clarity.
would encourage us to stay away from the travel lane as much as we can all feel comfortable, just from safety of people. So that's why we've shown it the way we've shown it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's certainly something that, as a consideration, pedestrian safety is hugely important in this area. There was a pedestrian fatality not too long ago, fairly nearby. I know adding pedestrian infrastructure just along this property line won't mitigate and solve all the pedestrian safety issues, but anything we can do to make it a safer pedestrian environment is an improvement.
The city's position remains unchanged. There is a discrepancy we have just with the UDO and the SSDM. We can change that internally, but again, the more separation and sidewalk we can get is for the gap line and the green connectivity.
Thank you.
questions.
Okay.
The underground storage system, is that going to be infiltration or just like a tank?
Storm Tech is most likely, that's the most common one around, around Western North Carolina. That's likely what we go to,
Okay. And
which has an
that's-
infiltration piece
It
to it
does.
and an isolator row and those kinds of things.
Great, okay. Could you or someone else on the team speak a little bit to the history of the site? I mean, specifically, there's kind of this large, odd mound on the north side of the stream that looks like fill, looks like maybe it was a driveway or something. Just tell me anything you know
Yeah,
about
it is
why
a,
that's
it
there.
is a fill area, and it was done by the current property owner. I don't know the number of years, but several years ago, not something that's happened in the last few years. And we're still evaluating all the contents of that exact fill, but yeah, it was.
So you're evaluating, meaning phase one environmental assessment, or?
I think we've already got a phase one environmental assessment, but we're just evaluating like what all is in that field
Okay.
and just what all, what do
Okay.
we want to keep and what don't we want to keep.
Right, but you don't foresee a hazard there. You've already looked at
No.
phase one. Okay. Is there any haul off with the site plan?
We always are trying to be a balanced site. We're not quite to that point yet, but we think we are. We think we're a balanced site, and that's why you see some of those walls and why you see some of those field slopes. It's just never a good idea to put it in a truck if we can help it.
Yeah, yeah. And then I was a little confused with the existing conditions. We're only seeing some trees identified within the stream buffer, like the lower half. And I wondered if the survey just didn't extend all the way up, just so we have a better sense that that is an intact, riparian buffer if you're including it in the tree canopy. I just want to feel good that the
Yeah,
trees there.
lost Will, but I was going to say, I'm pretty sure in 719.3 or 2, it talks about the different ways you can do tree canopy preservation. We're more than 2 acres, so we can actually do it off of aerial. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I was going to say that is, ground truthing is only required if it is less than 2 acres. So something where it is 18.64 acres, that's obviously, we are okay with aerial imagery as long as it meets those standards under the tree canopy preservation requirements.
That said, we're still trying to save we're going to save everything along that stream buffer because we're not getting into it. So what's there is going to remain to be there, and we'll have to confirm those things as we go along. But yeah, that's the intent.
Okay. Just making sure if I got everything. My other question was, there's not a sidewalk on the other entrance, the north entrance, and I just wondered if that's why that is.
Yeah, so like I was mentioning in the presentation, that area is a little steeper road, so we could certainly have a sidewalk there, but it's going to include steps or a sidewalk that would be out of ADA compliance. So we took just a better look at it, just thought that the connectivity through the southern end, where it's a little flatter and a little easier to traverse, would be a little more preferable, and it just cuts down a little more.
Thank you. I think my next question is probably for Mr. Allen, but I know we're just looking at the site plan right now, but as the developer, are these apartments going to be 3-bed, 2-bed, 1-bed, a mix? I mean,
Thank you. My name's Matthew Rankin, and I'm with the development team along with my partner Brian Wise. So to answer that question, yes, there's going to be 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, and townhome units. So, I think the average size floor plan is around 1,100, 1,150 square feet between all 3 of those, or 4 of those floor plans.
okay. Thank you.
Sure.
One thing that's noted in the staff report, but I don't see in the project conditions, is kind of some detail and commitment to the residents of the property now and moving stipend. I guess I'd like to hear from the applicant. What is, how is that value determined? What is that intended to cover?
I'm going to look at Mr. Brandon, so I'm forecasting that I'm going to ask you a question here in a minute. I'm not sure that it's appropriate for a condition. and I'm not sure how we could put it in as a condition. The thing that we are working on is that plan, and we've been talking about that today and last week, and I've been talking to Sam about that as well, to come up with a plan that involves the stipend, but also the resources and finding other units for people to go to. One thing that I do want to say about this group of on the development team is keeping those folks there as long as they wanted to be there. If you wanted to get rid of the issue, you would have already, terminated those things long ago. And so, kudos to them for keep it in play for as long as folks want to stay. And if that's appropriate for a condition, I think that we can come up with that. But you don't have to answer that now, Brad, but that's something that we can discuss, because it's one of those ones that makes me feel kind of.
Yeah, Mr. Allen, just to respond to that briefly for the commission's benefit, a condition of that nature would be somewhat unprecedented. Typically, that is something dealing directly with displacement. That's something that happens fairly regularly with new development, obviously, when you're replacing whatever is there now with what is going to be there. And typically, a relocation stipend, although it may be part of a package a developer may have in place, we typically have not documented that. I would not say that it is impossible for us to document that. North Carolina law does not currently recognize that as a normal condition, but we have extended that with a voluntary agreement by the applicant in the past. If that's something that the commission felt very strongly about including as part of the conditions, what we would want to do is probably work closely with the applicant's legal counsel to fashion something that was legally appropriate.
And I'll commit to this commission and staff that we'll follow up with city legal on that. And while I'm doing the commitments here, I think that we're on the same page with the sidewalk, Sam and I, but we'll sit down with Chris Karen before city council and come up with something appropriate there to make sure we're on the same page on that external sidewalk.
Thank you for that, and appreciate the legal context on permissible conditions. It strikes me that by acknowledging that it's important to assist with the relocations, the applicant is sort of owning that challenge, and I appreciate that on the one hand. On the other hand, $350 gets next to nothing if you're a vulnerable renter tenant living month to month and looking for a place within this community. So even if it cannot be a condition, my personal feeling would be that the applicant should look harder at what an appropriate level of financial compensation would be for those existing tenants. And to be clear, as if I think I understood you, the applicant is allowing them to remain as long as possible. That's laudable. These tenants are paying rent. They're allowed to remain there because they're providing rent to their landlord. They're not required to as month-to-month tenancies, but the landlord is receiving compensation. It is not just at the generosity of the property owner that they're remaining there. Is that fair?
Certainly fair.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments before we open for public comment?
Thank you.
Thanks. At 4:09, we will open for public comment. If you're here to speak on this matter, please approach the mic, state your name clearly, and you have 3 minutes if you're speaking as an individual. Come on up.
My name is Alan Metzger, and I represent the Carlisle Condo Neighborhood. I'm on the board at our HOA. First of all, we did have a meeting by Skype with the developers, and there were at least 50 or more people expressing their desire that this development not take place. I didn't remember one person on the call that was a current resident that felt it was a good thing for our quality of life. I heard you mention that you live in the area. You can't drive on Sweeten Creek at certain times of the day. Out of our unit, we have 80 units in our development. You can't make a left-hand turn. You simply can't do it. There's no openings in the traffic in both directions so that you can make that turn. I'm appalled that more than 30 minutes was spent talking about sidewalks.
no one uses sidewalks on Sweeten Creek. Cars, cars, cars. What was the most important thing that they said? 500 parking spaces. 500 additional cars right next to our neighborhood trying to get in and out of Sweeten Creek. Yes, they have two. That just adds to the problem. How are people, they're talking about, oh, this is great because the commute is less to work. There are going to be lines of cars in this new development trying to get onto Sweeten Creek in the morning. And the quality of life for our condominium neighborhood is going to decrease substantially. And there are very few ways of getting to Hendersonville Road. Russ Craggan's. It's going to be a zoo. And the road that goes down there, a stoplight at the Exxon station where the fire department is, it takes sometimes 3 stoplights to get through there. And now we're adding 500 more cars. Now, obviously, they're not going to be out on the road all at the same time, but at least 100 are. I mean, I just cannot believe that the traffic is not the #1 issue that be discussed at this board meeting. Not sidewalks, cars, traffic. And I listened. What was the answer for the DOT? Oh, this is great, this is fine. What was the letter? Was it a letter approving the development? Did the DOT approve this development? They did. There's a public letter that says, oh, this is fine, this is not going to cause any problems?
I'll ask you to just address the board, and we can ask questions of the applicant after your comment.
Okay. I mean, I just can't believe it.
I think we're at time for the 3 minutes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Would the applicant respond to just the details of what DOT does, the TIA requirement in our ordinance, and the process for DOT review? And I guess, under our city ordinance, what is the applicant required to do with the TIA?
Yeah, so the city ordinance is any project that has more than 100 peak hour trips, AM or PM, that requires a TIA, a traffic impact analysis. NCDOT's threshold is actually much larger. It's 3,000 trips, or average daily trips. So because we are expected to be more than 100 peak hour trips, then they do a study. And there's a third-party consultant, TIA consultant, who does that. He or she works directly with the city of Asheville's traffic engineer, Chris Carnes, as well as NCDOT. That would be Chris Medlin and Nick Dorado. And they come up with a scoping document, which is a 9-page document that goes through what is the expected project. So this is an apartment complex. It's this number of units. We're expecting this amount of traffic. And they start to tell them where they want each of the studies done. So then that traffic consultant then goes out to the field, puts in these devices that tracks the number of trips that are happening today. So existing traffic, to sort of speak to what he's saying. It talks about what's happening today. And then they do the equations and the work in their system to project, okay, when this project happens in future year build out with the normal increase in traffic that's just happening in general, plus this project, what is the expected wait times at those intersections? What's the expected turning movements and all that? So it's a pretty exhaustive study. The TIA's usually somewhere between 200 and 400 pages long. It's way more than anybody ever really wants to look through, but it's pretty long. And yeah, the DOT gives us a letter. Department of Transportation, August 22nd, final decision. And it goes through their review, and then at the very end of it is their conclusions page, and it says, our recommendations based upon opening year 2027. Upon review of the TIA and the Synchro files, Figure A, which is our site plan, entitled as recommended improvements for the TIA sealed 7/1/2024 appears reasonable. However, their intersection of Mills Gap and Sweeten Creek should be monitored for improvements. That's the one I was mentioning earlier. So this is straight from DOT back in August that says the TIA was completed correctly further reviewed and no recommendations of improvements on DOT roads were expected.
And who, the recommendation to monitor the intersections, where does that go? Who does that fall on? You know, that's not on the obligation of the property owner, so who carries that recommendation?
It's a good question. I think it'd be a combination of DOT and the city of Asheville as other projects come online, but there's nowhere here that says because you're building an apartment complex, you need to study this intersection on some sort of interval. That's not common.
Thank you. I appreciate the more detailed analysis or explanation of what a traffic impact analysis constitutes. To the member of the public, we are not unsympathetic to traffic concerns, general impact of development concerns. It's one of many, many factors that go into an analysis of the appropriateness of any development that comes before us. I think that, because of the nature of our body and looking at how this fits into land use regulation, we do look at the technical details regarding all aspects of a project, regardless of whether they might be the most appropriate to the neighbors or particular impacted constituent groups. It's important that we follow, the land use regulations that we have, understand the staff report, and then make our own judgment on whether there is compliance.
And I appreciate those remarks, and just as a quick follow-up, the triggering amount is 100 peak trips, and in the AM is 119, and the PM is 120 in this, so it's just over that mark. That said, we can make the full report that the city already has available, and Sam can send it to our speaker.
Thank you. It is clear, Sweeten Creek Road is clearly an area that needs improvement. DOT knows it, the city knows it. I think the question is whether it's appropriate for developers to be held responsible for a lack of infrastructure improvement. And that's, we're here tasked with compliance with UDO, not necessarily advising DOT on their pace of investment in infrastructure. But it is a relevant comment. I appreciate you being here, and hopefully the discussion and further elaboration of details from the applicant was helpful, at least to understand the process. Any other questions, comments from the commission?
Well, I have other comments, but should we continue
Oh,
public
I'm
comments?
sorry, yeah, thank you. We are still in public comment. Any other members of the public here to speak on this matter? If not, I will close public comment at 4:18. Now,
Okay.
more comments, questions.
Yeah, I appreciate the public comment. I appreciate you, sir, and I appreciate the applicant team here. And I looked at this one closely, as I mentioned before. This is my area of town. I look at all projects closely, but I specifically empathize with Sweeten Creek, which I commute multiple times a day myself. It is very frustrating. And the hard part about this one is, this board is tasked with looking at not just the individual neighborhoods, but the needs of the city as a whole. And we are experiencing a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis now. And this project does provide more supply, which is one of the most direct ways for us to combat this housing crisis. That being said, the Sweeten Creek situation is very frustrating. I myself have been on this board and approved other projects on Sweeten Creek in that corridor. I stand by those decisions. However, my tolerance for what we can allow on that road is becoming short. That line in the sand is getting closer for me. I know DOT supposedly has it on 2031. That was originally like 2026. It keeps getting pushed back. And I know that's not our planning staff's fault. It's an NCDOT thing, but there surely is something what could we do to further pressure Raleigh office to improve that? Because I just don't see how that road can take a whole lot more. And this, the benefits of gaining that additional housing supply have to be weighed against the pain it causes on that traffic problem for those local residents. And the scales are getting closer even on this one. And I hate to just shut the door on future developments just because someone got there first, but ultimately, as a member of this council, at some point, I'm going to have to start acting that way. That's kind of what I'm considering right now.
Any other questions, comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Would anybody like to make a motion on this issue? Nobody's leaping out of their seat.
I'll make a motion.
Do you have the text in
Do you
front
have
of
the
you?
text in front of you?
Yes, bottom of page 5 of the staff report.
I move to approve the conditional zoning request for the property located at 3,183 Sweeten Creek Road from residential multifamily high-density RM16 to residential expansion, conditional zone, and find that the request is reasonable, it is in the public interest, is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, and meets the development needs of the community. In the request, 1, it provides infill development in the targeted growth areas. 2, increases the supply of housing in proximity to schools, transit and parks. And 3, rezones property to transit supportive density in nodal clusters along transit corridors.
Do we have a second?
A second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you and best of luck.
There you go.
Next up on our agenda, we have the first of 3 zoning text amendments. First being a request to consider a proposed zoning text amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances to revise the Level 1, 2, and 3 development review processes. The planner coordinating review is Will Palmquist. This is an item getting its 3rd punch on the frequent customer punch card before Planning and Zoning Commission, so excited to see it come back around. And before we dive into the staff report, we do have a commissioner who's would like to disclose a potential conflict for our consideration.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to disclose to the public and the board, I do work for a local residential builder. There is a portion of this update that discusses changing certain thresholds around the duplex, triplex, quadplex. While I am not an owner of this company and I do not have specific projects coming up that in particular, this does involve a product or a type of unit my company would be going after, could be going after. I'm happy to answer questions or go over to our city legal advisor here if he has any recommendations. I just want to be above board with the public and my fellow commissioners.
I appreciate that disclosure, and I would ask Mr. Branham if you could provide some guidance on whether this rises to potential conflict, appearance of conflict, or what our process should be.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for bringing this to the board and the public's attention. The law that's pertinent to potential conflicts of interest with regard to zoning text amendments is this. If the commissioner or member of the deciding body has a direct, substantial, and readily identifiable financial benefit that they may receive, or interest, excuse me, not just benefit, but interest, from approval or disapproval of the proposed motion, then a conflict exists. This does not include items that might be somewhat speculative or general in nature to a larger population outside of a few individuals. Having discussed this prior to the meeting, it is my opinion that a recusal is still somewhat speculative and fails to necessarily meet all 3 of the characteristics Based upon that, I do not believe a recusal is legally necessary. Certainly, the possibility that this is a conflict that a third party might allege, a recusal is always possible if you feel like the vote needs to be protected at a very, very conservative level. But I believe a strict interpretation of the statute would not absolutely require recusal this evening.
Thank you for that. And also, given that, you know, this body is not the final word on the matter, it will go before City Council. It's, in my opinion, that you should remain a part of the discussion, deliberation, and vote on this matter if you so choose.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to be part of this discussion. I do not feel like, based on legal definition, that it's a substantial or specific to my case, but if the rest of the commissioners feel this I should be accused, I'm happy to abide, but I think I can remain biased.
Thank you. Any other comments or feedback? Well, let's proceed. Mr. Collins first.
Yes, we'll get to Will very shortly, but I'm going to take you all through a quick refresher on where we were on the UDO updates pre-Tropical Storm Helene, and just what to expect with tonight's presentation and how these amendments will work together. Okay, so I'm Chris Collins, Assistant Director of the Planning and Urban Design Department. Happy to be before you this afternoon. So talking about what we're looking at tonight overall, geographic areas and applicability of these amendments that are designed to enable and promote housing on transit supportive corridors and in mixed-use zoning centers. These will be applicable to slightly different subsets of zoning districts based on the three amendments you're going to see tonight. And bear with me, I'll tell you exactly how that evolved in a further slide. And we won't be proposing changes to residential zoning districts at this time at tonight's meeting. And we're going to have a refresher on what that schedule looks like as well. So first off, let's talk about the overall approach to the UD update for housing. What we're looking at tonight, first up, is amendments aimed at promoting housing on corridors and centers. So that is not our residential zoning districts. These are transit supportive corridors. They may or may not currently have transit lines or high frequency transit lines, but these are corridors with the transportation infrastructure to handle such a thing and zoning that supports densities to support transit, whether it's there now or not. And these are the first set of proposed changes you'll see aimed at promoted housing, while neighborhood changes are in development alongside anti-displacement measures, which may be regulatory, may be programmatic things like home repair grants and rental assistance tools that are outside the realm of zoning. So that takes us to what will come after this is work on what has been done kind of from a regulatory perspective, a neighborhood overlay that would probably look like an overlay to enable more housing in areas where that's deemed appropriate. And I'm not going to go too far into that. That's in development. We don't have everything right now, but that will be taking into account areas that may be seen as more vulnerable neighborhoods through things we've looked at in the missing middle housing study and the affordable housing plan. And beyond that, we'll look at further UDO refinements. Further UDO refinements are not in active draft right now, but we anticipate those will look like site-specific standards that aren't really zoning districts specific. These will look like, if you're familiar with Section 711 of our Unified Development Ordinance, those are like our landscaping and buffering standards, parking standards. We're going to look at parking standards tonight, but parking standards as far as dimensional requirements and things like that that apply across the board right now. And look at ways to reduce barriers to housing in those sections as well. So that's a quick refresher. I want to talk about the communications and engagement approach for these amendments tonight as well. We can answer questions as we go, but this is really the same for each of the three amendments that are going to follow my presentation. We have utilized a new method, which Chair Barton mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. It's an UDO text change engagement hub. I know we've gotten a lot of engagement there. In fact, we've gotten 33 to 35 responses amongst the three amendments leading up to tonight's meeting time. So in terms of public engagement on zoning text amendments, that's pretty good. Pretty good number. We are going to be hosting an online information session and an in-person information session. All those details are going out, but we'll be holding an in-person information session on these amendments on January 30th and an online session on the 31st. And the online session will be recorded and made available for everyone moving forward. These amendments you're going to see are supported by the missing middle housing study findings and the goals and strategies of the Affordable Housing Plan, which was finalized right before Tropical Storm Helene hit and put us on pause for a bit. And mostly that's going to be in the form of removing barriers to housing from our regulation. And we have also, before the storm hit, we did conduct some targeted focus groups and surveys with local and regional housing developers to try and judge, will this get us there? Will this move the needle somewhat? What we've heard on tonight's amendments, now going back to that red slide with the process, that is just the 3 amendments in front of you tonight. I'll summarize that through the Text Change Engagement Hub, through our targeted focus groups and surveys, and through the Missing Middle Housing Study and Affordable Housing Plan. We've heard a support for making it easier to build housing, specifically with these amendments. We've heard a lot of support for these changes as they may enable more housing. We've heard that, hey, this is great, do it now. We have heard concern about not applying these citywide yet. We've heard a lot of people mention, hey, why aren't we doing this citywide? And we've had folks express some concern regarding the effectiveness of the incentives for affordable housing you're going to see, that whether or not placing the burden on the developer alone is enough to incentivize affordable housing. Maybe there's some tools outside of zoning. We're in the business tonight of proposing zoning tools, but I'm just letting you know that's out there. Folks are looking for multifaceted approaches to promoting and incentivizing affordable housing. And we've also heard, hey, it's good to require bicycle parking still, but there are still going to be problems with bicycle mobility in Asheville, even with more bicycle parking spaces. So the gist of a lot of those is these are good changes. Let's keep going is kind of what I've heard, or why aren't they bigger, right? And I'll remind this group, going back to that phased approach where we're starting with transit supportive corridors and mixed-use zoning districts, the next step is to look at residential districts in neighborhoods, and that work is active and ongoing at the staff level. It was active and ongoing before Helene, and it is now active and ongoing now as well. So I don't like to call it phase 1 and phase 2, but let's just do that right now, and just for simplicity's sake. So some changes since we first started talking about this. A couple of these amendments you've seen various forms of. Why are they back? Why are they slightly different? A couple of things that are really big that have happened since then. Everybody knows Tropical Storm Helene came along and changed some of our built environment. And we've had to conduct an analysis of those heavily impacted areas and how those affect these amendments that were ready to go before the storm came, right? So really what you'll see is some sensitivity towards what districts these are applicable in to account for the need for a possibly slower approach in those areas where heavy damage was faced and could be faced again in the future, right? Our special flood hazard areas and such. And leading on to that, Brad Branham gave you a quick primer earlier on the North Carolina General Statutes and the impact that was made on them through Senate Bill 382. That's, as was stated, 382 really took away our ability to implement more restrictive zoning on sites, right? So everything had to be analyzed to make sure that we weren't running afoul of 382 so that we would propose a successful amendment. We have done that. We are confident what comes before you tonight does conform with 382, so hopefully you can move confidently in that regard as well. So overview of proposed changes. You will get a specific presentation on each of these, but we're going to be looking at development review thresholds, basically allowing housing developments to be approved at a larger scale without a conditional zoning or council approval, and providing incentives to make that scale even larger as affordability is introduced. We're going to be proposing to eliminate off-street parking requirements for residential projects within these areas. And some specific zoning district standards where you'll see relaxed structure size standards, some items that may incentivize residential in those districts by providing more relaxation of standards, a removal of density limits, really controlling through form and site situation, and an incentive to create pedestrian-friendly development that meets the goals of our comp plan through front setbacks. That's really the one this group hasn't looked at all yet, and that's where we'd have to make some adjustments for 3D2 to make sure we were working right there. So what's this going to look like? We're going to have 3 separate zoning text amendments. You will have 3 staff reports through 3 presenters who have worked hard to focus on these subject matter areas and make sure we're bringing you what we think is the best and most effective tool for these areas right now. As 3 separate amendments, you'll need to look at 3 motions and 3 votes to make a recommendation to council. And personally, I don't think you have to do it this way. I know to Brad, but it might be easier to stop at the end of each individual amendment and consider comment or a motion. The only concern, if we have duplicative comment on those things, I don't know. Do you have any opinions, Brad, on how to handle that?
It's going to be up to the chair and the commission, how you would like to handle the meeting. I think you have leeway to do these things item by item, going through the full process of the presentation and then the comment and vote, or you can combine some of those sections if you would like. Sometimes there is an allowance to combine all of the public comment, but in order to do that, you've got to wait to have the votes until all the presentations and then comment have been given. But I do think you've got leeway to handle this as any way you'd like, as long as you do conduct 3 separate motions and 3 separate votes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that said, I'm going to reduce this. That is the end of what I have to tell you tonight before I turn it over to Will to get us started. And of course, if y'all need any time to discuss how you want to do the motions and public comment before that, it's probably a good time before Will gets going. Good.
Thank you for that overview. Really helpful to see kind of how this tonight fits into a broader initiative around UDO updates. We got a lot of comments around what happened to missing middle housing report, landscape buffers. So I think this is helpful to say that's coming. So stay tuned. As far as process for these 3 items tonight, there's enough detail and difference in them that it probably would be helpful to have 3 separate presentations, open up public comment. I also will acknowledge that we are planning to take a recess after 5, so maybe between the first and the second 2. So anyone who is here and wishes to provide public comment on the second 2 and doesn't want to stick around for after the recess could provide public comment during the first public comment period for the future items. Did that make sense to? It might have been too.
Yes, but you'll still reopen for public comment.
Correct.
Each individual
Yeah.
one.
We will have public comment after each presentation with a recess plan between item number 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Sound good? Mr. Palmquist.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. Will Palmquist with Planning and Urban Design. I'll be presenting the first of the 3 zoning text amendments before you this evening, this one dealing specifically with project level thresholds. So this is a little bit of background about what project thresholds are, but I'm actually going to start by telling you what they are not. So this will not change what uses are allowed in specific zoning districts. So there might be mention of certain kinds of development in different levels for those types of projects in different kinds of districts. But what really controls the uses is the table of uses in a different section of the UDO that we're not touching this evening. So we're really only talking about, in this section at least, which kinds of projects are reviewed as different kinds of levels of review. And on this slide is outlined the 3 major levels of development that the city reviews. The first one is level 1s, and those are administered by staff just offline through comment letters and response to applicants. Level 2 projects are the next scale of projects. Those are kind of medium-sized projects. Those go before a technical review committee of city staff, and they have special requirements for things like pre-application meetings and neighborhood meetings as well. And then you're most familiar with level 3 projects that do come before the TRC and the Planning and Zoning Commission, and those typically require a conditional zoning to a expansion district just like the item we had earlier this evening. So as is known amongst us, you, the public, and developers, that level 3 projects that require conditional zoning take significantly longer to get approved for their zoning entitlement than other types of projects. And that adds a lot of time, cost, and probably most importantly, uncertainty for projects that come before you and us to review, not knowing whether they'll be approved or not to move forward. There's also some other sections of the UDO that require projects to make improvements based on certain criteria under Section 711 to full site compliance, and also for sidewalks, the construction of new sidewalks, and these proposals amend some of those triggers, so to speak, that would require those items. So as Chris mentioned earlier, this amendment is only focused on commercial corridors in mixed-use districts. They're enumerated below. You can see a map of them here on the right. I'll note that you'll see the last bullet talks about River Arts District zoning. Essentially, one change made post-Helene is that we decided to include most of the RAD districts in this threshold change, but we're leaving out RAD River and RAD Open Space, as well as the River District, which is a separate district, for the reasons that those geographies mostly fall within the special flood hazard area, and we felt it was, at this point in time, not appropriate to include those in an effort that would increase development, perhaps. So that's one kind of tweak we've made along the way. This map shows a different view of those districts. You can see mostly major corridors, Patton Avenue, Smoky Park Highway, New Leicester Highway, Tunnel Road, Hendersonville Road, Brevard Road, Merriman Avenue, downtown, CBD, parts of the River Arts District, and then some other kind of nodes of commercial and mixed-use activity in the city. So talking a little bit about the framing of where these amendments fall into in regards to our comprehensive plan, these amendments that you'll see shortly do support a number of goals in the plan, such as encouraging responsible growth by simplifying the UDO and allowing for a broader range of allowable densities and compatible housing options, increasing and diversifying the housing supply by reducing administrative barriers to housing development and diversification, and celebrating the unique identity of neighborhoods through creative placemaking by encouraging expedited development review for projects that incorporate affordable housing. Further, these amendments also support goals in the Affordable Housing Plan, including to increase the supply of housing that meets the diverse needs of current and future residents, and to align place-based policies and programs with city initiatives, with related city initiatives. So, just a little more background about the proposals here. You all were actually the body that drafted and proposed the initial amendments to Section 759, changing some of the thresholds for levels 1, 2, and 3 projects. The most significant change being made is to measure projects that are residential in nature by square footage instead of by units. So that was a major consideration that you all had proposed back in April to say, for instance, as an example, the conditional zoning that was here before us earlier this evening was 200 units or so, which is above 50, of course. I think they were over 100,000 square feet, so they would be considered a conditional zoning under these new regulations being proposed technically, but there are some projects that are, say, 75 or 100 units, and they might fall below 100,000 square feet. So that's a major change, that for non-single family developments, it'd be based on square footage of the building, just like we do for commercial projects. Those were approved at the April 6th meeting. We further refined those as mentioned, and are also further refining requirements for full site compliance and new sidewalk construction. So this is the proposed baseline between a level 2 and a level 3 project for this geography of commercial corridors in mixed-use districts. So there are a few different categories here. You'll see residential would now be between 35,000 and 99,999 square feet instead of 20 to 40 units. And then a level 3 would start after 100,000 square feet instead of at 50 units as currently on the books. Single-family detached would still stay at the 50-unit threshold. Mixed-use development would basically remain as currently existing, which is at 150,000 square feet for level 3, and that's if they have between 30 and 80% of their project as residential. Commercial, office, and institutional would remain at 100,000 square feet, and then industrial would be at 100,000 square feet as currently existing today as well. What we've also done is to build in some incentives for affordable housing for these districts. And essentially what we're trying to do is say if a project provides a certain amount of affordability through a deed restriction, just like they may do through a conditional zoning process, they can move to a higher threshold trigger. So it's a way to not only incentivize development in these areas, but also to incentivize affordable housing. So, for instance, for the first tier of affordability and the higher threshold, if a project can deed restrict their units to have 5% affordable at 80% area median income for a minimum of 20 years, or 2% of the units at 60% area median income for 20 years, their threshold trigger for a level 3 project requiring a conditional zoning would be raised to 150,000 square feet. And you can see that kind of move down the chart. The very bottom one being the most permissive, 20% at 80% AMI, or 10% at 60% AMI would be a threshold of 300,000 square feet. And that would be that, meaning that it can be done by right without requiring a conditional zoning, as long as they met all the requirements of the underlying zoning district. So that's kind of the goal behind these tiers as they're broken out and proposed here. We also have a corresponding set of tiers for the mixed-use projects, which start at 150,000 instead of 100,000 for the non-mixed-use ones. And essentially, it's the same rubric. It's just basically a deviation of 50,000 square feet higher to start with, and then a final tier that's 50,000 square feet higher than non-mixed-use projects. So those are the changes to level 3 and level 2 projects, trying to move more projects to be by right outside of a conditional zoning process for all the identified reasons earlier. There's also a number of changes proposed to level 1 project review that noted here. And essentially what this would do is expedite the review of smaller scale projects that currently have to go through a site plan review, and they have a turnaround time and revisions required, and projects would still have to meet zoning requirements. It would just be a smaller, a more expedited type of review. So essentially that raises that threshold to a project having 4 dwelling units. That doesn't trigger the level 2 threshold. I would raise the threshold for additions from 500 square feet to 1,500 square feet. It would eliminate the trigger for projects that displace existing parking or generate the need for more parking. And it would also remove the trigger for the changes of use for a site. And this is noted as a change that's not reflected in the marked up text available online, but has been brought to our attention as an important consideration that we're proposing to include as part of this amendment. There's also changes proposed to level 1 projects in the downtown CBD district. So the CBD has its own set of rules for level 3, 2, and 1 projects. For level 3 projects, we're removing the mention of changes of a higher impact as proposed tonight, since we are proposing to eliminate that from the level 1 site plan review process. So essentially it would just be new construction or additions for the downtown triggers for level 1, regardless of whether it's a change of use to a higher impact. Higher impact is defined in our land use table and elsewhere in the code, in different tiers of impact, potential impact to the community or the neighborhood based on how a use is classified. So full site compliance under 711 requires things like landscaping, parking dimensional requirements, and so forth, open space. And when a project has to provide those items, it provides a certain level of benefit to the community, but it also encumbers that project with a high cost. We're trying to find a more balanced approach to this, since many projects, or even just tenants of a space, are trying to open a new business perhaps, but they're faced with investing a significant amount of money into a site that may not be equitable or really resulting in an outcome for the business development community that we're really looking for here. So basically what's being proposed here is that we would modify the full site compliance trigger for any new development except for residential projects containing 5 or more dwelling units. We would remove the impact of the trigger for changes of use to a higher impact, as shown in number 2. We would actually lower the trigger for major subdivisions to 5 lots or greater, and that kind of goes more in line with the first bullet to kind of rationalize and make those at the same unit number. And then number 6, we would modify that if an existing paved parking lot was proposed to be repaved or demolished, that would not trigger full site compliance if they were just kind of rebuilding the parking lot. Most importantly, at the bottom, would remove the trigger for what we call the vacancy trigger, that if a site is vacant for 180 days, typically now they'd have to, if a new use, regardless of what it was, wanted to go into that site, they'd have to bring the whole site into site compliance, which is, we find many times to be onerous, and it results more often than not, than we would like at least, with vacant buildings staying vacant and being unoccupied. Finally, the triggers for sidewalk requirements, which are separate from 711. And the main change here is just to remove that vacancy requirement. So similar to full site compliance, for the other elements, we would not require properties that are vacant for 180 days or more to build new sidewalks when a new use was proposed to be located there. So a minor tweak that came to our attention recently that we'd like to include in these amendments this evening that's not in the current marked up text is regarding the level 2 projects in the downtown. So level 2 projects outside of the downtown. So for level 2 projects that go to the technical review committee, there's some staff notification that goes on with that, and mostly involves the posting of a sign at the site, so folks are aware when they see the sign that there's a review proposed in the future for a project there. The language that we've run into that's been problematic is the very explicit requirements of what exactly the sign says and exactly the size of the font on the letters, which are required to be 6 feet in height. We've developed a new kind of zoning sign that will work for all our boards and commissions, and it technically does not meet the requirements of having the words notice of technical review meeting on them. We've kind of consolidated all our signs into one main master sign that we can use for all our different boards and commissions we have to post signs for, which is obviously better for cost and staff time and just ease of having not 10 different types of signs floating around the office. So we would like to remove this explicit language. We will still post a sign at the site. It will still be notifying the public about the meeting and the projects. It would just not be as hemmed in to this exact wording as existing today. So some of the pros of this proposed amendment, it would obviously create higher allowances for residential development, which would reduce review time and the uncertainty for projects that would otherwise require conditional zoning. It may promote the development of more dwelling units, including affordable housing, and it may incentivize smaller and therefore more attainable dwelling units by switching from a unit count threshold to a gross floor area threshold. I think this was a really important point that the commission discussed when they were initially drafting the proposed changes back in April, was that if you have a cap of 50 units before conditional zoning, a project may plan to build 49 units, and it'd still be the same square foot area as maybe a 100-unit project, but they're going to be larger units perhaps, more expensive. Maybe the profit margins are the same for the developer, but the city's getting fewer units when we need more units. One con identified by staff in these proposals is acknowledgement that many of our zoning districts today promote a pattern of development that does not adhere to some of the goals in the comprehensive plan. We are working on amending some of those this evening, and we'll continue to do so. But just stating that the fact remains that enabling the larger and more by right developments without adjusting these districts may lead to larger scale developments that do not promote the goals of the plan. This is just a rundown of the review process for these amendments. As mentioned, April 3rd was the initial review by you all to raise the threshold and remove some of the level 1 site plan triggers. We had a working session a few weeks later to really go over the details of this and get closer to, agreement between staff and the commission about what was the right approach and the right details and some of the wording. The Planning and Zoning Commission reviewed another version of this proposal back in June, which raised the threshold and removed some of the triggers for level 1 site plan compliance, and sidewalk requirements as well. Staff recommends approval of this zoning text amendment based on the reasons stated above. We do have this following conditions we'd like to add to any motion to approve, including the change of use trigger for level 1 site plan review to be removed, some clarifying language that was suggested that would reference the table of uses as the source for the allowed uses in the district, just to clarify any confusion perhaps that could be created there. And then third, the changes proposed to the public notification requirements for level 2 projects outside of the CBD. And that concludes my presentation. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Palmquist. This is the product of a tremendous amount of work by staff and this commission. Appreciate the public feedback that has helped kind of guide and shape and keep this on the radar. And appreciate staff's kind of openness to the conversation that's led to a very complicated but positive proposal that we're looking at tonight. So just, appreciate all the work that has been put into this. I've got a few kind of, in the weeds questions and comments, but love to hear what others have to say.
As a matter of procedure, so after this board votes on this, it then goes to city council, is that?
That's correct. Any change to the UDO requires city council approval ultimately, and then if and when they approve it, it becomes the new law of the land.
Because I'd like to, when we have a council person here, not to put you on the spot, but I'd like to hear if there is any opinions on this. Just not that you speak for every council member, but I ultimately want to send something to council that's in the direction that they're wanting to see. And I think that would guide me to the discussion if there is a problem you see or something.
Thanks for asking. I think we spent, pre-storm, this committee and council and the community spent a lot of time really sorting through. We have a big goal of housing supply and how are we going to get there? And some of it felt like a step forward, 3 step back. But I do feel like we got to a place, my observation of council is we got to a place of clearly saying this is the type of thing we're ready for and this is places that we need some more time on. And I think council is pretty clear that we need some more time on thinking through the in-neighborhood spaces and how to address displacement concerns. And so my sense is that these proposals really stick to the corridors and meet the spirit of council's goals. And so I'm excited to have that council conversation. I also think that when we're conceptual versus rubber meeting the road of all the details, we all really comb stuff with a fine tooth. And so I love being on P&Z because I'm like, let me get the pre-show, and so I can see that. But I still think there'll be a lot of detailed discussion with council. And we have a new council person, Councilman Bo Hess. And so he was a very active candidate, and so paying attention. But I really encourage y'all to reach out and give him the opportunity to learn extra, because things can come up really quick on council's agenda. But I'm getting the sense, even though it's tentatively scheduled on council's February 11th, that there is a appetite from much of council to have it be heard and to start the council conversation then.
I appreciate that. I just thought it was fair to do a temperature check.
Always.
See where we were.
Yeah, because if it wasn't, I'd be like, whoa, we don't want to waste somebody's time, let's pause, or this, that, or the other, or we should talk to folks. But I'm feeling like we're making the readiness.
I appreciate that as well. I appreciate that context, because I know previously when we had approved this, it was for all zones. And I get maybe why some of this we would be breaking it down into commercial corridors. With thresholds in particular, I feel like this complicates things in the UDO a little bit, because currently it's citywide, right, our thresholds? Maybe with the exception of how it's handled in CBD, yeah. And so, for example, the project that was before us tonight on Sweeten Creek Road would not be affected by this change. And so we would be seeing something like that again. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and I get that there's hope towards looking towards those neighborhoods and possibly expanding this into there, but it is incredibly expensive to go through a level 3 process. The developer has to hire for detailed design to get through technical review, and they have to, usually they don't have to hire legal to help them get through the process. And on average, it takes about $90,000 of upfront cash for a developer to get through the level 3 process with no promise of approval. $90,000, that's very limiting. And what we're doing is we're basically saying only a select group of developers can do this type of project. And to me, that's discriminatory. And so, although I am incredibly frustrated with the pace of this, in this housing need, and how limiting that this particular, what area of the city that this would be impacting, I do not want perfection to be the enemy of progress. And so I am excited to see this, and hopefully there's appetite not only to approve this, but to continue the work and get these thresholds changed citywide.
I think that's very well said. I have very similar feelings. I feel that what's included in this provides the toolbox and the sandbox, which is limited, and that that sandbox can be looked at in the future. I think this provides the tools to get to a larger project by right, with the expectations baked in. We've heard some public comment and feedback about unfunded mandates, building in affordability into the thresholds. And while I'm sympathetic to that, I agree, and I think there's some pretty compelling case study in other municipalities that have baked in affordability to thresholds or density without funding for those affordable units. I actually think this is a pretty generous give back in exchange for a modest amount of affordability. For just 10% of 80% AMI units, you can double what's allowed. So we're kind of raising the floor and providing the ability to raise the ceiling with some affordability. So I agree. I think the most difficult thing for me is the geographic limitation. I think I've accepted the affordability tiers as kind of an experiment to see what the development community comes back with. One question for staff on the geographic limitation. You mentioned the inclusion of certain RAD districts and the exclusion of RAD River and RAD open space. Was there any thought to just eliminating the special flood hazard area, regardless of underlying zoning district, from a higher intensity, just to give more time for consideration of impacts to flood protection ordinance?
You're saying using that as the geography for the threshold instead of the zoning districts in those areas?
Yeah,
Yep.
because the special flood hazard area is really the controlling delineation for flood protection ordinance. And, while I think you're right, excluding RAD River and open space gets a large chunk of it. There's certainly special flood hazard area that lies outside of, those zoning districts.
Yeah, I think we considered it and just thought from an administrative perspective it'd be difficult to try to intermingle the two. If the flood hazard area changed in the future, we thought it was less confusing in a way to do it more by districts that generally align with geographies. But we did certainly consider that. It just felt like an administrative difficulty to use that as a threshold level instead of the zoning districts.
I guess from a land use policy standpoint, my concern would be, since we are so limiting where the new thresholds apply, very limited areas in the city, no residential areas will be impacted by the greater allowance for thresholds. Are we really concentrating not just on Patton Avenue, Tunnel Road, but the areas of the River Arts District that are outside of those two districts? Are we kind of incentivizing a higher intensity of development in an area where we all still need to kind of look at it as a community before we, provide a by right process for very large developments in that sensitive area?
So it's a great point. I think the underlying zoning districts would still control the level of development. So the RAD, other sub areas have varying degrees of height limits and so forth. So you'd still be constrained somewhat. So you're not necessarily, the sites are a little bit smaller. It's hard to say exactly what would happen. It certainly allows for larger scale development to happen by right in these districts identified. It doesn't guarantee it will necessarily, and obviously other areas in the city can still go forward with conditional zoning still. So I think we just want to make it easier for projects to be able to do larger scale projects out within these corridors and mixed use areas. Understanding that the underlying zoning districts would still control as far as things like height limits and setbacks based on site constraints. So we find that that's a limiting factor, that kind of letting the zoning do what it's supposed to do without setting these arbitrary, more or less, limits on what needs to be a conditional zoning. That's kind of the intent. But I think your point is well taken, that that could be happen.
Thank you.
Just one offering. We had looked at a lot of things in the wake of the storm. What's going to happen? How are we going to do things moving forward? And regulating based on the special flood hazard area type of stuff. For me, there were some concerns bringing that in kind of a use-based zoning kind of function where it doesn't function now, right? And I can't say for sure if that's sketchy ground or more confusing, but in an effort to keep some simplicity to an area where we are, as one of the commissioners said, complicating the UDO a little bit right now by splitting these thresholds up by district. It felt simplest amongst that confusion to stick with the zoning districts as a guide for where we can and can't do this, as we do a little bit now between CBD and other districts. So that's kind of my addition.
Thank you for that. Other comments, questions of staff?
I would just like to say I'd like to see it move forward because we've been working on this a long time, and while it doesn't have everything we want, it's a portion of it. So I'd like to see if we have public comment.
Thank you for that. And at 5:11, we will open up public comment. As a reminder, after this item, we're going to be taking an extended recess. So if you're here and want to provide public comment for the other items, you're welcome to, or stick around and we'll see after recess. So I will open public comment at 5:11.
Hey, Warren Sugg. I'm lucky enough to get to work in this code and with staff and with you guys on a lot of different projects. And I think there's been a lot of good work that's happened on this from staff and planning board and city council, giving some feedback. So I really applaud you guys for doing that. It's, you know, it's not a perfect change, but it's a lot of good changes. I think there's a lot of good moves that were made here. But I would do anything we can to just encourage a quicker process. And I'm not saying that to put you guys out of work or city council out of work, but you know, there's a lot of big issues that you guys could deal with at both groups. And there's a lot of these projects that hopefully these will help us move towards. But I would just encourage you to even think about more ways to allow staff who are excellent. You've got a staff that is not green. They have a lot of experience. They know the code frontwards and backwards, and they know where those deviations are before anybody does. So I would just encourage us to really rely on staff as much as we can, and it's probably adding to y'all's plate, but you've got a great staff. Let's use them as much as we can. And then, you know, the for sale single family product, you know, it feels like it's been a little bit left behind. I know there's not that many infill projects that'll hit that threshold, but there's a few. And it's just a place where I think it really can get gummed up. And to your point, hundreds of thousands of dollars can get spent before you know if you have a project for the first lot, if you will. So great job, but I just want to give those remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Joe, Archibald, commissioners, council, staff. I think some of you know me. I was going to make a few comments, but then Commissioner Cycle, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, really spurred me to come up here and say that, and this goes back to comments I wanted to make about the annual report. I had sent Commissioner Barton an email. I really applaud this commission for the amount of work that you got done this year and some of the goals that you have. And just to keep encouraging you that even though this seems like it's taken a long time to get here, I'm trying to think, Brad or somebody probably remembers the first time I brought up, when are we going to change the UDO? And it was probably 6 years ago now. I'm encouraged that this is happening. So just stick with it. It's going to happen. And I do think that these are great changes. They're not perfect, no, but, you know, do you want to let, you know, perfection get in the way of good? No. This will help. It will help with development. And perhaps it is the way to get the community and the public on board with the next set of changes. I believe me, during my 6 years I spent here, it was, what is the next easiest step we can make? And this definitely feels like the next easiest step. I would like to make a comment about the annual report. I think Commissioner Barton probably will know what I'm about to say. I keyed in on the words Long Range Planning Commission. And as I sat listening to this, I thought to myself, if this takes even 3 projects a year off of a review by this commission, is that then time that this commission can rightly look at long-range planning, which it is tasked with. So just to kind of keep that in your thoughts. But again, want to applaud you and your fellow commissioners that aren't here for doing a great job, and obviously staff on getting these changes done, and look forward to seeing even more. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Andy Paul. I'm a lead organizer with Asheville for All. I've been watching you guys do what you do for the past year, and it's been really exciting. So I'll echo what Joe said, and also thank you to staff as well for working on all this stuff. This is really a big step forward, and we're really excited to see how it works in conjunction with the other things that are up tonight. So we're super psyched about that. I liked what Jason said, that we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. That's a refrain we use a lot in the pro-housing movement. We do have concerns about the unfunded mandate for below market rate homes. While we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good, we're also concerned about unintended consequences. And I won't go over our whole argument. We sent you guys a letter. Will was very helpful in making sure the graphics appeared because they didn't appear at first. But it's quite possible that some things will go through, some things will continue to be conditional zonings, maybe because they don't have 10-foot sidewalks, maybe because they can't meet certain affordability requirements. But what we're concerned about is there'll be things we don't see where developers are making certain decisions about where to build and when to build. And as research has shown, ultimately, the result of that is that renters pay the price. We do want to see this thing move forward, absolutely. And so we made a suggestion in that letter that's in the Google Drive about just kind of bending the curve a little bit for those unfunded mandates. But overall, we're excited about this. I do want to say, since I do want to get home to my toddlers, that I understand for whatever reason we're taking this phased approach to tackling UDO problems. We have had the missing middle study for over a year. Staff has worked out things like backyard lots, allowing duplexes everywhere that are already drafted. So I don't totally buy the idea that we're still working on that. But in terms of parking, it's going to make the UDO so much simpler if we say, just like Anchorage, Alaska, just like Birmingham, Alabama, dozens of other cities have just eliminated parking mandates citywide. And I'll also say one thing that I just saw this morning, which is the White House Council of Economic Advisors does a report every year. And so the 2024 report, so the good White House, talked about parking reform and talked about how it is a way to mitigate segregation. And so if we're talking about anti-displacement, if we're talking about affordability, right now we have core neighborhoods that are increasingly off limits to renters and first-time home buyers. And those parking mandates might be a way, removing them might be a way to get some infill and to desegregate North Asheville and West Asheville and maybe some other spots. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else here like to speak on this matter?
Hey Council, my name is Zach Rahana. I'm a concerned citizen. I'd like to make some comments on all the UDO changes. I believe primarily the parking minimums amendment is imperative, and I'd like to go through a quick hypothetical of a commercial building in West Asheville. Let's say a area of 960 square feet, approximately 6 parking spaces on Haywood Road, is being developed, and someone wants to build a building there. They could build a 3-story building with a restaurant on the bottom floor, commercial, and a set of apartments up top. This would approximately be 400 square feet per apartment. You could have 4 units there. This building might sell for around $1 million, around there, in that ballpark, but this property would make about $5,000 yearly in property taxes for the city. I also believe that the benefits are further than just values and property and taxes. This would be for more residents to support the area. And the other option is an empty parking space. The city doesn't really make money off of off-street parking that's privately owned. Currently, if this hypothetical restaurant wanted to build parking or to be built there, they would require 10 off-street parking spaces. And this is if the restaurant only had 12 seats and 2 employees. Any more for 3 seats, you need another parking space. So the current amendments for the project thresholds in commercial districts are also necessary in conjunction with the new parking requirements. And I think to further extend them to allow for residential developments in residential areas would even further their impact. Not only do these amendments bring immediate relief to the housing crisis and displacement disproportionately affecting lower classes from Helene, they also create long-lasting impacts that empower citizens to change the course for Asheville. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else for public comment? Seeing none, I'll close public comment at 5:22. Any further questions, comments from the commission?
I'm very excited about this and kind of somewhat go against, Commissioner Siegel and Commissioner Barton. And it is frustrating that the geographic area has been shrunk, but I think we're gaining momentum. If this is proof of concept. As we get better proof of concept with smaller measures, bigger and bigger steps can be taken. So it's not quite, and it's more like a logarithmic scale almost. Like you gotta win a few little ones and then bigger and bigger things.
That's assuming that we win this one, though, because we
Yes,
did pass the other one, right? The other amendment passed this board,
Touche.
right?
Well, and
We can't control what happens past here.
Regardless of the debate about an unfunded mandate, what has come back to us are higher square footages as level 2 in exchange for affordability. So, we dreamed to 100,000 square feet, and staff has come back and said, dream to 300,000. So,
yeah.
I think that's encouraging progress, and we'll see how that plays out. We don't know. It's untested. In this community, we don't know how the development community will react. Maybe everybody will sort of still stick to that 100,000 to come through, but it gives an option. I will, we haven't talked about the level 1 stuff. Really appreciate, Will, your elimination of change of use. That was going to be a comment I had there. And, as much as we're focusing on the pro-housing side of raising the thresholds on 2 and 3, the level 1 reforms are, I think, really dramatic and going to have an incredible impact on small business owners and kind of the hurdles that have been faced in adaptively reusing our building stock to get it back into active use in the community. So really appreciate staff championing and working through. That was probably a messier exercise of finding all the associated sections. So definitely excited about that one as well.
Propose the motion.
Go for it.
I move to approve the proposed wording amendments to Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances and find that the proposed amendments are reasonable, are in the public interest, and are consistent with the city's comprehensive plan and meet the development needs of the community. In that the amendments will, 1, simplify the unified development ordinance and allow for a broader range of allowable densities and compatible housing options. 2, reduce administrative barriers to housing development and diversification. And 3, encourage expedited development review for projects that incorporate affordable housing.
Do we need to add those
Oh, I'm sorry.
with the following additional amendments?
Is that the following amendments as presented? That work? Sorry.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Yep, the motion carries unanimously. Look forward to seeing this at council, maybe February 11th. Thank you all for coming. You're welcome to stick around. At this time, we'll take a recess. How long do you think?
You know, it depends how you want to do it. We could grab some pizza and then, you know, not to say Sam can't have any, but we'll save some for him. And he can give his presentation perhaps, and we can save time that way.
Sure.
Maybe 5 minutes to kind of scuttle around and get situated, and Sam can present while you all munch, and then, I don't know, something like that. We'll save him a slice or two.
Let's take a recess until 5:30.
Okay.
Order in the first floor conference room. All right, Commissioner Faircloth, grab your pizza. Then we'll get going.
For the public record, this will be the fastest presentation I've ever given if there's pizza behind me. I'm going to set a speed record here.
Noted.
Yeah.
Oh, the last one was pretty quick.
Yeah.
All right, we are back in session at 5:35. Next up on our agenda is another zoning text amendment, a request to consider proposed zoning text amendment to Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances to revise residential and commercial parking requirements. Planner Coordinating Review, Sam Starbaum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Again, for the record, my name is Sam Starbaum. I'm a Planner 3 with the Planning and Urban Design Department with the City of Asheville. And again, before the Planning and Zoning Commission, we have changes to the UDO for parking requirements in certain districts. Just to go on a background of what the UDO currently does require, there are minimum off-street parking spaces for residential uses based on the type of use. This is also true for other types of uses, right? So this proposed amendment does eliminate office, business, and industrial parking minimums. There are also maximums in our UDO and also a mechanism for administratively exceeding that maximum parking requirement by providing pervious pavers. This is going to change this a little bit, but what we also find currently that is in the UDO is that there is a section for eliminating off-street parking. This is in 2C4 of 711. Again, if you're within 1 mile of the CBD district, you get to remove parking. If on-street parking is permitted on the streets and the developer investigates with the transit authority the provision of a transit stop. Those are the requirements right now for eliminating off-street parking. We are going to make that a little bit easier. So what does this amendment do? It does 3 things. It eliminates mandatory parking minimums for residential developments in select districts. It also eliminates commercial, business, and industrial uses parking minimum uses in that use table as well. It increases bicycle parking from 5% to 10%. It also changes with the formula a little bit and simplifies it in our form districts. So Haywood Road Form District, River Arts Form District, there were some differences there. It also makes all bicycle parking 10%. And then you also have the elimination of the ability to exceed parking maximums. So again, previously there were parking maximums, but those could be exceeded by simply providing pervious pavers. What this new amendment will do is say that it has to be a technical modification and it has to be a conditional zone, or you have to go to the Board of Adjustments and make a statutory case that you have some sort of hardship to need that parking, which is hard to say how that would turn out, but it is unlikely, I will say. So it does make exceeding that maximum harder. But largely, we find that this is in line with these comprehensive plan goals. This is something you heard in Chris's presentation. This is something you heard in Will's presentation. You will hear it a 3rd time and again a 4th time in Vadilla's. But this is largely supported by the comprehensive plan and the multimodal housing plan here, highlighting where it is supportive in living Asheville. We're encouraging responsible growth. We're increasing development along transit corridors by highlighting which zoning districts this elimination occurs in, and we're also reducing administrative barriers to housing development and diversification. In your packets, you can see in the background bullets exactly how much a parking space costs per development as forecasted by some economics experts with the American Institute for Economic Research. It is also worth pointing out what has changed now as I present this to you after Helene, that this reduces the amount of impervious space. So this is of a benefit for runoff velocity, slows it down, and also for the quantity because of the ability for that water to percolate. Again, talking about the Affordable Housing Plan goals, the Affordable Housing Plan did talk about a general reduction in the number of parking maximums and those requirements, and we're just aligning place-based policies and programs with city initiatives and working through that. So here's where the transit routes currently are, and you can see that these transit routes, which are generally based on cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, follow exactly the zoning districts that were seen in Will's presentation, and you will see in the next slides. So the eligible districts for the reductions occur here. It's going to be in community business, highway business, Haywood Road, River Arts Forum District, all forum districts. This will also happen in River District. This is one of those where that is important because, again, of impervious surface and what that does for runoff water. Then your office business, and regional business. This is going to be, as Will said, you're looking at large portions of Charlotte, Merriman, Tunnel, Patton, Sweeton, Brevard, and Hendersonville Road. And that list is not exhaustive. There are many other areas where that is impacted. Here's just a second map of where, it was sort of cut off in that first slide. So you can see no changes in the districts, but that's just where it looks like as you move further south on Hendersonville Road into the southern portion of our jurisdiction. So here are also the pros and cons of such an amendment. The pros, it supports all these goals that I had just mentioned. We're looking at sustainability initiatives that were not mentioned that this supports. And ultimately, this text amendment can potentially reduce the urban heat island effect and make developments cheaper. We're trying to make it easier to build housing in the city, and this is one way this can happen. Of course, the con is that there is no guarantee that developers will choose to not provide parking. A good example is what we just saw with 31 to 83 Sweeten Creek. Their parking minimum was 328 spaces. Their parking maximum was 608 spaces. They were in the middle at 492, which is still 160 above that minimum. That is something that we have to weigh, is that even in these corridors, they may still choose to provide parking. And there's just, again, if you're familiar with the infrastructures, particularly in portions of West and North Asheville that will be impacted by this, there's the potential for more demand of on-street parking, which could exacerbate a limited supply. And I know this is a slide that the committee wanted to hear. We had talked about this before in previous meetings. And it is worth revisiting what this commission had determined. It had previously heard something similar to this on April 3rd of 2024. This was more about radii. You were looking at areas within a quarter mile of transit supportive corridors and areas within a half mile of transit stops would be eliminating parking requirements, and then the multimodal commission heard this in May, and then it was back in Planning and Zoning Commission again for some of those amendments. And staff does recommend approval of this one as opposed to others. Again, largely for the reasons Chris stated. I want to be clear that this is not where the buck stops. Further UDO refinements are coming, but we have received explicit and direct orders to focus on transit corridors. This is where we can do the most good now as we then look more holistically at housing things. I think there will be a slew of housing changes related to parking, related to a whole host of other things that are coming down the line, but this is what we can do to reduce barriers now. And so staff is recommending approval of this zoning text amendment to reduce parking in the districts. And that is really my presentation. I know that there is a lot of familiarity with this one from the commissioners, but I would be happy to answer any questions you may have before discussion and deliberation.
Questions, comments for staff? I do have one. Thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate staff's work on this, and I like the previous amendment. I think this is, there's so much good in where this is headed and kind of the broader trajectory of eliminating parking minimums citywide and what that could do. So I would certainly advocate for continued evaluation of whether we could go citywide, understanding the needle that staff is trying to thread in getting something that's palatable for right now. I think this is very good. The one exception, or the one question I have, is around expansion districts. So obviously our thresholds is trying to pull developers away from expansion districts and have greater utilization of underlying zoning districts. If for some reason a developer still needs to utilize level 3 go the residential expansion or commercial expansion route, they will be subject to parking minimums, correct?
That is correct.
Do you think there would be appetite to adding those, since those aren't geographic-based districts? Is there concern that those would then be within residential neighborhoods, or, that is a tool that's used, it's not really a map district.
We had this discussion as staff. It is remarkably difficult because, and was ultimately excluded because of past expansion districts. This is something where even though a lot of reasons for a conditional zoning to an expansion district will still come before your commission and city council, there are opportunities for expansion districts to happen in predominantly residential areas. A good example would be Hog Creek, right? So we were focusing primarily on these areas. If we were to include expansion districts in that, we would lose a lot of control over keeping our focus on these specific zoning districts. And again, there are, with redevelopment, anything like that, we can start finding this encroach into residential areas, which we were trying to avoid and we're told to steer away from.
Yeah.
Again, it's sort of use-based when you do a conditional zoning. Again, a good example, 3183 Sweeten Creek or Anka Commerce Park was another good example where that would be commercial, but just out of an abundance of caution, we did not include those to make sure that our focus stayed specifically on predominantly urban corridors and transit centers. Which is not to say it can't be changed in the future.
Yeah, I completely understand that approach, but just to play the other side of that coin, residential expansion districts have to come before us in council anyway, and so could we not make parking a condition?
Conceivably, you could, but there is no guarantee, and
Right.
that's the challenge. This is to distill fact from nuance with expansion districts was incredibly hard, and we played it safe here.
If you want to have reduced number of parking spaces below the minimum, they could ask for it, and it could be granted as a modification as part of the conditional zoning as well. So.
That's true. That's true. So if a residential expansion district happened to fall geographically within one of these underlying zones, they could just request
As they can currently now, yeah.
that condition. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add one thing. By keeping the parking minimums in the expansion districts, you functionally create a bit of an incentive to use this by right process that allows larger developments in the corridors where it's well served by infrastructure and possibly transit, as opposed to that CZ process. Because again, you're going to use a by right process and you also don't have parking minimums. So this is not a real thing.
Thanks for the background on those discussions. It's helpful.
Any other questions, comments? Shall we open public comment? We'll open public comment at 5:48.
Hello, can everyone hear me well? Hey, I'm Stephen Riblett with Strong Towns, and I'd like to speak a bit about this amendment that was just brought up. I think an important detail of it is we're not removing maximums, so it isn't necessarily harming any developer that wants to have more parking. All it's doing is creating more flexibility for everyone. On that note, I'd like to mention that encourages flexibility and potentially further density in the future. In addition to that, there are other cities that have gone further than us with regard to this, so I think we might be being too conservative here. This is with, for example, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Birmingham, Alabama, and even Durham in 2023, who did away with residential parking minimums, period. So I think there's room for us to do the same. This was also part of the 2023 Missing Middle study that Asheville helped fund. so it would be following in those footsteps. And lastly, the decisions that we make now, and the sooner we make them, not only affect us tomorrow, but 5, 10, and 20 years from now as our communities are able to grow into what sizes they ultimately desire. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commission, staff, Councilwoman Ullman. I'm Tim Watkins, also with Strong Towns Asheville. I wanted to voice my support for this proposed amendment, but voice a stronger support for full repeal of parking minimums. While I appreciate the steps being taken to address the outdated parking requirements, a partial repeal doesn't go far enough to unlock the full benefits of this policy can bring to our city. It's frustrating to see that this amendment is in a way less impactful than the amendment that was already approved by this group twice last year. Full repeal of parking minimums is increasingly common and has been implemented in cities throughout the country such as Minneapolis, Seattle, Birmingham, and has been implemented in tourism-heavy cities like ours, such as Portland, Maine, Burlington, Vermont, and Duluth, Minnesota. Lastly, parking minimums have been fully repealed closer to home in Raleigh, Durham, I think all of Durham County actually, and even Gastonia. In Seattle, ADU permits tripled after after making parking optional in 2019. And in both Buffalo, New York, and in Seattle, after repealing parking mandates, the majority of permitted homes and housing developments would have been illegal without the repeal. We have a housing crisis that has only been exacerbated by Hurricane Helene, and we will likely have a budget crisis stemming from a reduction in collected property tax. We can take a lesson from these other cities that show that a full repeal of parking mandates can and will lead to more housing being built. I would say be bold and recommend a full repeal of parking mandates, but it's not even bold. It's not even bold at this point. It's becoming commonplace nationwide, and it's recommended in multiple city studies, plans, and it is in line with the goals of the comp plan. It's well past time we stop taking baby steps and instead make meaningful policy changes that will make Asheville more affordable, more livable, and more financially resilient. Thanks.
Thank you.
Kara Wheeler, make that a little shorter. Kara Wheeler, also with Strong Towns and one of your neighbors in West Asheville. I am in support of this, but agree that we need to continue to go further. I specifically want to talk about how this affects missing middle housing. The Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan calls for livability, walkability, and affordability. That's a 2017 plan. More specifically, it calls out missing middle housing as a key strategy of encouraging infill housing in residential and mixed-use districts throughout the city. The city took action on the 2017 Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan by approving the missing middle housing study released in November 2023, 6 years later. Page 12 of that report says, trying to provide too much on-street parking can make a missing middle project not viable. Page 55 reads, the typical missing middle lot is the same size as most single-family lots, and only so much parking physically fit. Requiring more parking than what can physically fit on a typical lot may encourage or force developers to purchase adjacent parcels in order to accommodate the additional parking, which can have many unintended consequences, including increased cost. Page 45 continues by saying affordable housing providers also cited financing for rental projects can be especially challenging. Current parking regulations are difficult to work with and make development more expensive. The Missing Middle report lists parking minimums, aka costly parking mandates, as a barrier to building missing middle housing at all of the zoning districts the city included in the study, from RS8 to RM16. Transit density needs to be greater than 7 dwelling units per acre to get the 60-minute frequency, which we know is not fast and frequent enough to truly use transit by the city. If we mandate parking, we are inherently restricting transit. So we can't talk about transit and also be mandating parking. Recommendation 11 out of the Missing Middle study is reducing parking requirements. Missing middle housing units are intended in walkable environments where driving to nearby services, shopping, and food uses is not necessary. The city should consider further reduction in off-street parking requirements, potentially eliminating parking minimums. To close up, to quote the Living
Asheville Comprehensive Plan, page 300, the city should continue to monitor the impact of the 2017 changes and consider other changes to encourage infill housing. The missing middle report lists eliminating parking mandates as a concrete action the city can take to increase missing middle housing. It's time to act. Let's build housing and not parking. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, friends. Marty Benson. I'd like to take exception to one thing in the staff report. I do acknowledge that taking away parking minimums does not eliminate parking, and it doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't going to build a lot of parking. For me, that's not a con as to why to eliminate parking minimums. It's actually an illustration of why there's no coherent reason for parking minimums to exist. I want this commission to go back to what it did last June and incorporate residential parking minimum abolition into this citywide. Let's talk about what parking minimums are. They take away property rights from the property owner, and they do it in the name of a public bad. Exclusionary zoning, coupled with car dependency, have kept us in a level of socioeconomic and racial segregation that is paltry better than the Jim Crow era, even after the supposed abolition of redlining with the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And not applying this to residential zones is going to keep neighborhood-sized, human-sized housing, infill development from happening on properties where we need them. And let's zoom in from the 30,000-foot level down to 25 Indiana Avenue. That is a property that I own. It's 0.16 acres in size. I live in a 600-square-foot house. I used to live in a van, so I'm rattling around in that giant mansion. And there's space behind it for me to put a duplex, or according to the new North Carolina building code, a fourplex. If I did that, I'd have to pave the rest of the lot. I am a practicing attorney. You will see me in a suit, and when you do, I am raising money so that I can build workforce housing for blue-collar people who work on Haywood Road. And I don't want to build that housing for somebody to drive to Waynesville or Arden. I want to build housing for the service industry people who live in my neighborhood, and I want to fill my streets up with people on foot and bicycle so that, and this is real, and I am not being hyperbolic, the postman doesn't drive through the four-way stop sign that I live at 40 miles an hour without pretending to slow down. We need a critical mass of people in the street, and infill housing can help accomplish that. That is one of many reasons. There's no reason not to have a wholesale abolition of parking mandates in the city of Asheville. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment at 5:58. Comments?
I just want to say I wholeheartedly agree with all of the public comment from tonight, and going back, what are we, near February, so April, so like 9 months ago in the April meeting, I'll say again, as I did back then, I am in full support of abolition of parking minimums citywide, all districts. Whenever that wants to come before me, I'm there to support it.
Yeah, I still support this. I appreciate the public comment. I mean, I think we agree with your frustration. I think our vote before was to do it for everywhere, and that's not working, so we're trying to do something. I feel like I gotta keep taking what I can get. I wish it'd be more, and I know this line in here, this background that says one parking space can range from $9,000 to $8,000 seems crazy, but I put in $30,000 parking spaces on projects I've worked on, and that charge goes to my client. That's an expensive parking space for someone who didn't want it.
50,000 in structure, for sure.
Yeah, so it's real money that's hurting again. There's not just the housing crisis, there's a cost of living crisis going on too. So, but I'm still in favor of this, even if it is just part of what we want to do.
Any other comments? I guess my question to my fellow commissioners would be, do we, and maybe this is a procedural question of staff too, do we take a stand and send a, symbolic gesture to council that this doesn't go far enough by recommending a citywide abolition of parking minimums, understanding that that's not the directive that staff has been given to prepare for council, and understanding that that may mean it doesn't show up February 11th.
Parking minimums are archaic, and it doesn't mean, having a parking minimum doesn't mean people aren't going to keep supplying parking. Just as our planning staff has informed us, this project that we saw earlier had more parking than the parking minimum. What it does allow is for what the speakers were saying, is someone with a back, wanting to put in some smaller unit and some missing middle housing. It allows those things to happen.
So what's the...
I'm saying,
what's the
I really want to send, I really want to make a stand, yeah. But are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot?
Any other comments?
I think we can add that to the motion for sure. But we'd like to see parking requirements eliminated throughout districts.
Is it just a statement? We pass this, but then make a statement? Is that what you're proposing?
Or you could say something, I'm just riffing, but
Yeah.
something along the lines of, this is a good first step. We want council to revisit citywide 6 months after executing, so that's a different way to go about it, as opposed to saying this is what we want. But, the circle of conversation that we've been having is that there's support for this type of stuff, but we haven't sorted out displacement and gentrification risks. And so I'm fully expecting that council is going to look at those type of tools, and then we go, great, now we have some protections, let's get back to our housing. And so I'm trusting that that is truthfully what my peers are seeking as well. So you could do a staggered thing. That's really your leadership discretion, and just want to chime in with another idea.
No, I appreciate that. And I think one thing that has been part of the frustration as we've looked at this topic is we understand parking minimums, as has been articulated by our speakers tonight, as a barrier to some of the goals of having lower cost infill housing, more options within our neighborhoods that are facing gentrification and displacement pressure. So we see that that is a tool that's recommended countless times in municipalities, national studies, missing middle housing report. The question is how we make the argument convincing in a way that council members who've been resistant to anything in residential areas kind of can get on board with. One proposal, and maybe staff can weigh in on this, would be could we recommend alternate motions or alternate recommendations be carried forth to council? And if that were the case, would staff put their endorsement on one but not the other?
I think, I'm wondering in my head if what you're asking is maybe your motion could be, and this might be too wishy-washy, we recommend this, but if not, then at least this kind of thing. I don't know, because you're making a recommendation, it's not a final approval, so I don't want to get us afoul of the council process, but I understand the desire to communicate what you would really like to see happen, but also not derail something happening, right?
Well,
I
think we have a council liaison here. And this is discussed. She obviously has heard our wants for this to be citywide, and we're trusting our liaison to take that message.
I'm actually going to push that back at you, right?
Yeah.
You guys should call every single one on council and have a conversation with them. know, that's really important. And I call you all when I have questions, but I'm on it, so I think it's not just on the liaison, right? Because the politics of my relationships are there, right? Just to be really real. So I think it's it's a time to start the conversations with the decision makers. Or continue them, because we've been having them for a year plus.
And we can certainly document in our staff report this, so, you know, that's helpful.
Just as there is a committee section, this, in your report, there will be one at council's as well, which will capture this element. And while alternating motions present challenges, there is still the option to say, we recommend approval, even though we feel this way. I think there is, government loves a strongly worded statement, and for the wordsmith, there is a way to do that.
Alternative motions. I think it's enough in the staff report, and I think we can amend the motion to include that they expeditiously review opening parking or eliminating parking regulations in all districts. And maybe we put a time limit on it.
Sounds like you're ready to make a motion?
Yeah.
A year or 6 months?
I say 6
Good.
months.
I think 6 months.
Yeah, I say 6 months.
All right.
If I may interject, is there a timeline that staff has in mind for the displacement stuff coming back to council? Because I haven't seen that on the 8-week agenda.
So your council's going to get an update on that next week, on the post-Helene schedule.
Oh, great.
On the 28th. I will say that in staff's timeline, 6 months will fit within that.
Okay. All right, I move to approve the proposed wording amendments to Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances and find that the proposed amendments are reasonable and in the public interest, are consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, and meet the development needs of the community, in that the amendment will, 1, help promote equity within the pre-application process of land development, 2, increase opportunities for constructive dialogue between residents and land developers, and 3, create a clear and well-documented process. In addition, I urge council strongly to look at eliminating parking minimums in all districts within the city within a period of 6 months.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Carries unanimously. Third time's the charm. Thank you, everyone who showed up to comment on this. Thank you for staff. That brings us to our last item on the agenda, a request to consider a proposed zoning text amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances, to update certain commercial zoning districts and related code to better support the development of housing. Planner Coordinating Review, Vidila Sapika. Mr. Sapika.
Good afternoon, commissioners, ambitious members of the public. So we've talked about thresholds and off-street parking. Now we're going to look a little bit at other options within commercial districts where we have potential to open up housing opportunities. So a little background here. These are the zoning districts that we're reviewing as part of this amendment. They're listed on the left with the number of parcels, acres of land, and then percent of either these zoning districts or all non-residential districts. And I'll just call out and highlight that you can see HB highway business there is 47% and regional businesses almost 10%. So just those two districts make up more than half of what we're talking about here, and most of those are really along these big lots along all the corridors. This amendment aligns with the comp plan, like you've heard, encouraging responsible growth and increasing mixed-use development on transit corridors. The primary focus here is looking at potential, how else we can increase housing supply in these districts, aside from what we've talked about so far. So we'll go through 3 items. There are currently structure size limits in these districts, some density limits, and some issues with the front setbacks that are kind of a minor adjustment that we're looking at. So first, to talk through a little bit of the massing question. I have some visuals here to help talk through some of this, and some of this is background, so you can kind of glaze over your eyes if you're bored with this. So first, I want to mention something about setbacks, but I want to call out a change that we noted that we need to make that isn't in your reports because of the recent changes to state legislature, which is we were proposing, as you read, to change the corner setbacks from not having a corner setback to 10 feet. And we're realizing that it would be safer to not make those changes because in some cases that would be possibly more restrictive zoning. So we're along with this, if you propose to move this forward, we're suggesting that you strike the proposed changes to corner setbacks within office 2, office business, and NCD districts. So back to the massing. So this is, I kind of want to just point out, if we don't have structure size limits, just looking at setbacks and height, this is sort of illustrating the size of a building that can be built in this office 2 business district. And I'm illustrating here across the street. You can see these sort of gray shades of the footprint show up across the street, and the images of the buildings to the right. It would be out of context if it were that big. So the existing footprints that we currently have on the books seem to make sense roughly. We're not proposing to make any changes to those. So in this district, 8,000 square feet is the footprint size that's permitted. And we reviewed all the buildings within these different districts and their associated maximum building footprint size, and they all seem to line up with what is reasonable. There are some outliers with the maximum size, but if you follow this office to the right, the mean and median size buildings, they're smaller than what we have on the books. So this is just to highlight that we've done some review, and the minimum footprint size doesn't seem outlandish. But what is currently being hindered is that you can see on the right here, it says total square foot permitted. So in Office 2, you're only allowed 16,000 square feet, but you can have an 8,000 square foot footprint, and you're allowed to go 4 stories. So we're leaving a lot on the table. And so what we're suggesting is that we remove this maximum, where we change the standard to make this only for commercial. So commercial can only build up to 16,000 square feet, but for residential, we are going to be more liberal. This is the markup on the page, but I don't think I need to spend time on that because this is, I think, more clear here. So what the proposed changes for Office 2, as an example, the minimum footprint would stay as 8,000 square feet. Now we would say that 16,000 square feet isn't the total allowed, it's only the total for commercial. But if you are building residential, there is no limit, except for the height. And so in this case, if you follow along, the total permitted for residential would allow up to 32,000 square feet in that structure. So this is an increase by 100% of what we're allowing for for the total building size. Now, that isn't to say that you don't have to build out 16,000 square feet for commercial. Those lower floors can also be residential. So across the board, what this shows in these districts where we currently have a reduction in what is permitted for maximum square footage, you can see on the very far right, what we're proposing is a significant increase permitted by right for residential, if you include residential along these commercial districts. I know I went through that pretty quickly, maybe too fast, but any questions about that?
Thank you, Mr. Sefka. Questions?
I don't have any questions. I think the PowerPoint presentation was spiffier than normal. Looked really good. I mean, it was good. I like the little, the graphics.
Great.
Did a good job.
Thanks. Yes, we're not done. This is just sort of the first, talking about structure size. So now looking at density limits. In 2014, year before I came here, the city passed these sort of bonuses for affordability, where basically they allowed for double density if you make your project affordable. And this is what the current language says here for office district 2. Basically, you're allowed 20 units, but you can get 40 units if you make them affordable. But looking at the actual site, it's problematic, and we're suggesting to strike these density standards, because if you have in the same case an 8,000 square foot structure, and now we're saying potentially if you approve this, that as a 4-story building can be 32,000 square feet. If we're assuming what the code allows today, which is 20 units, and I'm not taking into account, area that might be sort of common space or stairs or whatever, it leads to 20 1,600 square foot units. And if you were to be allowed by right to build more than 20, you could double that. And so you'd have more naturally affordable units. We would get twice as many units. And really this just shows you that our current language promotes for larger, more expensive units. So if we can just get rid of the density limits, we will tend to incur or incentivize projects to maximize the number of units that they can build, and they might tend to build smaller units. Any questions about density limits?
I think this is great. I really think allowing the other factors to control what you can build is it's just kind of moving. It's sort of the fulfillment of where we have been moving the code since the density was increased a number of years ago. So.
Okay. Last part of this, now we're talking about front setback incentives. So this isn't a requirement, but more of a correction or a clarification in an existing standard, where in numerous districts, we have a front setback that's 15 feet, but we allow it to go to 0. So it's a voluntary option for the builder. But our current language is vague. It says here in the strikeout, you're allowed to go to 0 feet setback in pedestrian-oriented areas where road widening is not anticipated, provided that all parking is located to the side or rear and not closer to the street than the facade of the principal structure. And so we're just suggesting that we include some more specific language to make it easier for staff to determine whether they have achieved a more pedestrian design and setting some standards to clarify what that would mean. Admittedly, I think we struggled with whether we want the minimum. Another bullet, we're suggesting minimum 20% transparency on the ground floor, and to have at least one operable entrance facing or connected to the primary street. So here's kind of what that could look like. This is a building, you've probably driven by it on Hendersonville Road. It's a new Harbor Freight. Hendersonville Road is on the right, so the entrance to the parking lot is right off Hendersonville Road. You can see the entrance is nicely, from the standard about sort of pedestrian-oriented design and getting that front setback reduced. The entrance is facing the street and is facing the parking lot, so it's kind of a creative design that meets both. It has a walkway going to the sidewalk. And this is what the face of the building looks like on Hendersonville Road. They have window boxes, but they're basically just, covering the concrete block on the street. So admittedly, it's not really doing an effective job in making it that much more attractive. Maybe if you're not paying attention, it looks like it's windows. So I suppose you can make that argument. But we would like to add a new definition. And this is another point. If you move this forward, we're asking that you include this proposal to add the definition of transparency to section 725, so that we remove this in some of the transfer of since Helene, and we realize we need it. So we think it makes sense to have that transparency requirement, and I'm just bringing this up to you if there should be any other trade-off or alternative. Instead of transparency, whether murals would sort of function in a similar way, or green walls or something. But in other parts of our code, in the form-based districts, we have this definition for transparency. So at a minimum, we're proposing that should be there, but we're open to having a discussion if you want to talk about some of these other items.
We're ready for questions now.
And so this is what the this incentive would be. So I'll just open up for, I think, my next questions. So any thoughts about this incentive for reducing the front setback?
The Trader Joe's on Merriman, it's glass with just images behind it. Is that considered, does that fall within the city's definition of transparency?
I don't remember.
That example came to my mind as well, because I've always wondered. That seems
it's
really weird.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's effective though. Like, I don't think these buildings need to be showcasing every inner workings of what's happening inside their building.
I think it does count. I don't think, similar to here, I don't believe in our code it states that it must be transparent to the inside of the store, and which would be really difficult to achieve, because inside you have goods and products and
right.
shelving and right. So I don't think that's realistic.
Okay.
What is the intent behind transparency? Is it just the aesthetic, or more?
Pedestrian friendly.
It's I think a little bit of all of that. I think I don't think we have a clear understanding, but it's trying to, as we promote walkability and corridors that are more pedestrian friendly, we want to encourage that. So we want the sidewalks to be lined with buildings that aren't just blank walls. We want to have entrances that are reasonable to get to from the pedestrian path. Right, we want trees and greenery, and so all this kind of comes into play, and I think this is pointing to that.
Right, it's just imposing that 4-story brick wall if you're on a typical sidewalk.
Go back to the image of the Harbor Freight.
Yeah, are you saying that's not what we want? Or the second picture?
I guess I'm saying that this would maybe we could do better than this.
But does that currently meet our standard?
It must. I'm guessing that it does.
I mean,
didn't
it looks
go in
new, right? So, yeah.
Just to chime in, just because working with a lot of the staff that have tried to apply this incentive standard, that was probably deemed to meet the standard, but the standard is so vague right now, staff really can't, it's hard to say what the standard is, right? It says it's a pedestrian-oriented design is what we call it, but our code doesn't go out and say it is these things like what Bill has proposed tonight. I know we're thinking maybe, Brad, we might want to look at this one a little closer, right? before moving forward with this last provision.
Yeah.
As far as,
No changes tonight, but obviously, as we always do, we take a second look at all of this and analyze it, especially in light of new statutory changes before we get to council, just to make sure that council receives a fully updated version.
right. And so we're talking that in light of Senate Bill 382 changes, this might be pushing it a little far. Possibly.
But I guess the alternative is you can just do the 15-foot setback. This is an exchange.
Sure, it's an
for,
incentive-based thing, like it is now, and we do apply it, city staff do, as much as we can to allow people to take advantage of that incentive to reduce the setback, but we don't have objective standards. So our hope was to introduce some objective standards into the application of that.
Yeah, I'm certainly sympathetic that I believe we use this on a development behind the Mountaineer and off Tunnel Road, and I saw that as the subjectivity was allowed for positive collaboration with staff. We heard a public comment earlier about we've got a great professional staff of planners. My fear is when you create really objective measures, you get non-creative solutions from developers looking to meet it in the cheapest fashion possible. We have so many different site constraints, geometries, topography, and I worry, independent of any sort of legal questions that need to clean it up, I kind of worry that moving towards objectivity gets us, really uncreative results. And I don't know, I sort of like the subjectivity, but I certainly understand staff needing something that they can hold applicants to as a objective measure. So sorry, that's not helpful feedback.
I think it is.
I'm a little
I agree.
hesitant.
No, I agree with you 100% because you showed a couple examples, murals, green walls. I think all of those are great too, right? Like, do we have to? Does it have to be glass that, increases the amount of energy that the building needs to use to keep it cooled or heated or whatever? Could we do a green wall, which, and so, but those aren't the end of the options, right? So if we're objective and say glass, transparency, murals, or green walls, that may eliminate some other creative thought. So I agree with you. I think having some back and forth, maybe a more subjective, keeping it subjective, I don't dislike that.
I guess, that would be something I'd be interested in is what negative results have we seen from the current standard that staff sort of felt forced to allow because they didn't have objective standards? Like, what are is it the Harbor Freight, or is it, something that is maybe worse than we would like to see?
What if, just to put it out there, if the recommendation included transparency, including this as a definition, inclusive of a version that includes murals, green walls, and allowance for a similar treatment or something that we could work out?
Wasn't the language we used to use, like activate?
Yeah, I was going to say activation.
I know that's vague. It's fairly vague, but I think it's a
Right.
clear place.
Right. Is this activation, right? So I think we need to be somewhat objective if we want to get a deliverable that works.
It sounds like maybe tonight we're just not there yet on this one provision, even though there's, I think, so much good in all the other recommendations. But I'd be inclined to, make a recommendation to approve this absent the front setback change, which would include the new definition of transparency, and maybe include that in a further update. We know we have further packages coming our way on buffering. Maybe that is a standard that can be packaged with buffering.
Okay.
But,
Yeah, and I want to just reiterate Chair Barton's question. I mean, has staff seen any negative, what are the negative outcomes that are leading to the desire for this change?
Lacking objective standards, I guess sometimes it works out. Harbor Freight example was a good example of the entrance placement, right? They worked it out, but everybody seems to have
boxes or something, like if they push us, we don't really have anything to point at and say, that window box doesn't cut it. And maybe it's okay, but it certainly doesn't really do anything to enhance the relationship with the building or the public building. It's almost like it's pretty fine if it wasn't there, right? So I think we can still function this incentive as it's meant to be. It just, in push comes to shove, we can't really take a stand and say, you got to leave this thing. Because we don't have this kind of stand. So I guess not being able to pick out a really bad example other than that wall in Harbor Freight, there's probably a few others that just aren't going to mind now.
Okay. So there are actual projects that got
Yeah,
pushed through that.
Certainly. I'm functioning as a zoning administrator in these small applications when it comes down to it. When I come back and look at the code section, we can't do much in that situation. So, well, the goal here is to promote site flexibility and getting rid of that front setback. We hope to do so not at the expense of the experience of the pedestrian relationship. But for the most part, it functions okay. But it does push come to such shove situations. Then it doesn't.
So if this was in place, would there be zero setback on that?
It's the developer's choice from 0 to 15.
Okay.
Do we have any places where a zero setback, like where the property line meeting the road right of way, where like, let's say the road extends all the way to the edge of the right of way? Like I know with the Harbor Freight, there was some level of right of way, and so they may have had a minimum setback less than 15, right? But it was still set back, sorry, excuse me, a decent distance from the road, right? Because there's some level of right of way. Are there areas in the town where the road has exhausted its right of way? Where like a zero setback would be? Yeah.
The sidewalk would exit.
Or that the building would be right on the sidewalk, I guess. CBD, yeah.
But this doesn't apply to CBD.
No.
Yes. So
I'm just
where
curious.
this exists, there's likely
Plenty of right
plenty
of
of
way.
right of way. Yeah. Well, should we?
I'm less inclined to try to make a change
Mm,
on the incentive.
Take out the proposed change or keep the change as proposed?
The transparency? I don't think I'm ready to. It needs some conversation. I don't know. I mean, can we do that right here, right now? I don't know that I'm prepared.
No, well, I think we can recommend approval of everything except the change to the front setback language.
I'm on board with that. Yeah.
But did you have something, Commissioner?
I can just.
Should we want to strike that provision out of the whole thing?
Yeah, it seems kind of, it's a small part of the overall package. It seems like, especially with need for additional legal review, maybe that could be attached to an upcoming package. There's going to be more commercial district stuff coming our way, hopefully.
It doesn't stop.
But I do really support transparency or murals or other wall treatments, like having the interchangeability of options more than just a little decoration on the building. I mean, it needs to have some definition of what counts and what doesn't. But to just limit it to windows, I don't think that's enough.
Great, good feedback.
I always call that activation. It's not a word we can substitute for it.
We kind of wrestled with this in a very different way on the Duke substation on Patton, like what constitutes public art. And we were trying to really like provide something that's flexible enough, but also, activated. And I don't know that we got there. I think that's the goal. Well, should we open for public comment?
Yeah.
We will open for public comment at 6:34. Come on up.
always feel so tall. You all can hear me speaking.
Yeah.
I'm Scott Adams. I'm a land development planner with Compact Cottages. We're a local home builder. I shared some comments that we provided via email. It's put up in the public comment folder. Just a quick comment. Generally on a lot of these commercial districts, yes, they're generally along busier collector arterial streets, but there's actually a pretty good amount of these zoning districts that are what I would call interior adjacent to residential neighborhoods. And two quick comments that I would offer very specifically to the setback discussion are, one, the insertion of a 10-foot sidewalk requirement within a setback requirement is a bit confusing and almost sort of a secondary and conflicting standard. Kind of speaking more generally to sidewalks, the city's existing standards for sidewalks already exist in the, it's a mouthful, the standard specifications and details manual, basically for sidewalk design standards along collector and arterial streets, very simply 6 feet or 8 feet if you're doing a back curb sidewalk. So that's a general comment on the often confusing standards for sidewalks, and even in the previous conditional zoning, the question about what is the standard. So I would definitely encourage a more, while we're hearing a couple of specific things, there are a lot of adjacent standards that definitely warrant further discussion. So I would just say globally, sidewalks definitely deserve a more global discussion. Secondly, as relates to these districts, the issue of landscape buffers comes up, particularly when you've got an adjacent highway business district next to a residential district, what have you. Something that came out very specifically from the missing middle housing study and that's been discussed with staff and that was actually proposed this past July was really looking more holistically at those. Very often, if you're in a highway business district zoning district and you're building residential, because of the underlying zoning district, you're subject to somewhere between 20 and 30 foot wide landscape buffers, even if you're building residential next to residential. So that's definitely a potential barrier, especially for smaller urban sites that have these range of commercial zoning districts. And lastly, on setbacks, just the question about front, side, and corner setbacks, particularly for so many of these districts. If you're wanting to encourage the 21st century neighborhood corner store, what does that mean? That means the store is on the corner. If you're wanting zero lot line development of a neighborhood corner store, perhaps not a Harbor Freight, but generally in that discussion, if you are wanting a commercial building to be at the street, generally a 0 foot front and a 0 foot side setback are what best would fit that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, I'll close public comment at 6:38. To address one thing on the sidewalks being included in the front setback incentive, if, as we have contemplated, eliminate that or table that for tonight, that would also eliminate the minimum 10-foot setback, standard, because we would just keep the existing estate there. So I agree. I think that's an interesting point that needs to be examined, how that overlays with other sidewalk requirements. Also really appreciate the note on buffering. I know residential to residential buffering requirements are something that are squarely on staff's radar, and anticipate them coming back before us in a future text amendment bundle. So appreciate the public attention on that one. Any other questions, comments? Does anyone feel ready to make a motion? Understand how to weave it?
I'll give it a shot. I move to approve the proposed wording amendments to Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances, excluding the front setback incentive, and find that the proposed amendments are reasonable, on the public interest, are consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, and meet the development needs of the community, and that the amendment will, 1, provide added flexibility to encourage housing along commercial corridors, and 2, will simplify and improve the consistency of the zoning code to support all users.
I'll second. With a recommendation to amend your motion to remove the proposal for corner lot setbacks in office, office 2, office business, and NCV.
That's acceptable, thank you.
So we have a motion.
Second.
And a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our agenda. Thank you all for sticking it out with us and for the refreshments. Our next meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission will be February 5th at our regular time, 5 p.m., with a pre-meeting on the 5th floor at 4:30. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second? Aye.